You're about to take your very first breath, but instead of crying in a warm crib, you're screaming under the roar of a Star Destroyer overhead. Welcome, this is your life now. In this video, we're going through every Star Wars era, from bad but survivable to the absolute nightmare ones, where you'd honestly wish you'd thought twice before being born. So sit back, grab a snack and let the galaxy fade around you. And if you enjoy slow journeys through strange history, feel free to subscribe. Now, let's begin. Picture this, you're born in the galaxy during what historians later called the High Republic's Golden Age. And unlike most other times in Star Wars history, the word golden isn't that some historian being poetic. It really was as good as it gets. If you ever daydreamed about living in Star Wars without worrying about stormtroopers dragging you away, Sith Lords frying you with lightning, or warlords enslaving your planet, this is the one window of time you'd want to roll the dice on. The High Republic era was built on stability. The Republic was strong. The Jedi were respected and genuinely trusted, and most of the galaxy's population could go about their daily lives without ever seeing combat or oppression. For once, war wasn't the default state of galactic existence. Peace was. Travel, which in Star Wars usually comes with a risk of being blasted out of hyperspace by pirates or blown apart by Sith fleets, was remarkably safe. Think of the way humanity on Earth once looked westward, across the Atlantic, or imagine new trade routes through mountains. The High Republic had that same energy, but with hyperspace beacons and brand new starways instead of wagons and maps. It was a period of optimism, exploration, and, well, Jedi diplomacy. The Jedi weren't swinging lightsabers in wars every other week. They were mediators, scouts, diplomats. If you were a Jedi, you had one of the few jobs in the galaxy where people actually wanted you around. Think of it like this. Imagine the Jedi as a combination of your neighborhood cops, teachers, and travel guides, except way taller, more glowing swords, and mind tricks. A Jedi might show up on a frontier planet to negotiate a dispute between two merchant guilds, help prevent a natural disaster, or scout out a potentially dangerous hyperspace corridor. Meanwhile, the Republic bureaucracy worked surprisingly well. Governors and senators collaborated efficiently. Corruption was minimal. Basically, if the galaxy was a massive company, it was one of the few times the managers actually did their job. The Starlight Beacon is a perfect example of this golden age. Imagine a giant space station, not a hub for trade and diplomacy, but as a lighthouse for knowledge, culture, and hope. Chancellor Lina So, who oversaw much of the Republic's growth, saw it as a symbol of unity and stability. Jedi masters like Avar Kriss, Elzar Mann, and Keeve Trennis became well known not for their battle prowess, but for their ability to maintain peace, coordinate aid during crises, and inspire trust among the citizens. They were respected, admired, and more importantly, actually helpful. Life as a citizen during this era was good. You could even enjoy holodramas without worrying about a fleet of Separatist droids showing up. Culinary diversity was booming. Species from across the galaxy were sharing recipes, music, art, and occasionally questionable fashion choices. Planets experimented with sustainable agriculture. Medical innovations were rolling out, and urban planning actually considered disaster preparedness. Not something you'd say about the core worlds 2 centuries later. Merchant guilds coordinated efficiently, markets thrived, and cross-system commerce was thriving. And while people might have had the occasional grumble about taxes or slow bureaucracy, the general sense was one of optimism. The galaxy was growing, expanding into the mid and outer rim, and most people could see opportunities for themselves. Frontier systems, the far-flung planets at the edges of known space, had a little more rugged life. These planets had to be self-reliant, and that bred resilience. They had contingency plans for everything, from natural disasters to unexpected pirate raids. Communities formed tight-knit networks, trading skills, information, and, if necessary, supplies to keep each other alive. For someone born in a rim system, life was a little more hands-on, but it came with a sense of pride and independence that the core worlds sometimes lacked. Of course, the galaxy wasn't without its threats. The Nihil were a constant worry. Imagine rogue space raiders, who operated like a chaotic, interstellar gang. They disrupted supply lines, attacked vulnerable planets, and occasionally pulled off heists so audacious that even the Jedi couldn't stop them immediately. Then there were the Drengir, these plant-based horrors that corrupted worlds and systems in subtle, insidious ways. Luckily, intelligence networks were top-notch. Jedi envoys often acted as early warning systems, catching problems before they escalated into full-blown disasters. For anyone living through it, daily life could feel surprisingly normal. Kids went to school, festivals happened, citizens could invest in science, arts, or exploration. The Republic even supported terraforming projects, interplanetary research collaborations, and ecological management programs. People could genuinely feel like they were contributing to a galaxy that was bigger than themselves, and that their planet mattered in the grand scheme. It wasn't all smooth sailing though. Even in an era as golden as this, tensions existed. Frontier worlds might have struggled to get the same attention or resources as core worlds. Lanes were usually safe, but anomalies could still occur. Trade guilds occasionally got into disputes, yet the systems in place to manage these issues, both political and Jedi-led, were remarkably effective. The galaxy wasn't perfect, but if you were born here, you'd have a good chance at a happy, fulfilling life. And let's talk culture for a second. You had music festivals with alien performers, holodramas that explored philosophical ideas, and culinary experiments that would make any food critic's head spin. Humor was alive and well. Jedi themselves had a sense of it, sometimes even poking fun at each other. Science and innovation also flourished. You could see projects on multiple planets aimed at understanding ecosystems, medical advances that cut down on diseases, and terraforming projects making uninhabitable worlds livable. The Republic encouraged collaboration, so even planets with fewer resources had access to cutting-edge technology. For someone interested in knowledge, it was like growing up in a galaxy-wide university with no tuition fees and a library that spanned star systems. The High Republic Golden Age left a lasting legacy. Trade foundations built during this era lasted for centuries. Governance models set standards for efficiency and collaboration. Interstellar knowledge expanded, helping future generations understand ecology, medicine, and politics on a scale few had ever imagined. And resilience training, both formal and informal, meant that citizens learned to navigate uncertainty, even when the galaxy eventually fell into darker times. Being born in this era meant living in what could almost be called a utopia, at least by galactic standards. You weren't dodging Sith lords, surviving Imperial oppression, or fleeing extraterrestrial invasions. You had the freedom to learn, travel, explore, and enjoy life. Of course, peace and stability have a way of lulling people into complacency. The Jedi were powerful, the Republic was strong, and most citizens probably assumed this calm would last forever. History has a funny way of proving that assumption wrong, but for someone growing up here, life was undeniably good. Jedi Masters like Avar Kriss weren't only heroes, they were role models. Kriss, for instance, emphasized unity and optimism, showing that a Jedi could guide entire star systems without firing a single blaster. Elzar Mann's philosophical approach demonstrated that wisdom could prevent conflict just as effectively as combat. Keeve Trennis represented the potential of the younger Jedi, learning from experience while still embracing adventure. Together they created a sense of stability and mentorship that shaped the galaxy's future leaders. So if you ever wish you could pick a time to be born in Star Wars, this is the era you'd quietly brag about. You'd have a front row seat to interstellar progress, get to meet Jedi heroes who actually solve problems, and live in a galaxy that feels alive with possibility. And while history would later test the galaxy in unimaginable ways, those who were born here got to live in a rare pocket of safety and hope. High Republic Golden Age. It's the era where being born was a privilege, not a gamble. Fast forward a few decades, and imagine being born right after the Empire fell. The galaxy had just endured decades of oppression, fear, and sky-high body counts. And suddenly, like flipping a switch, it wasn't so bad anymore. This is the late New Republic era, a period where the galaxy is patching itself back together, and everyone's trying not to trip over the rubble. Luke Skywalker is starting to make his mark, not as a soldier this time, but as a legend shaping the future. His success as a Jedi has given hope to countless systems. He's out there, rebuilding Jedi traditions, trying to prevent the mistakes that led to the Empire in the first place. Other iconic characters had their roles too. Han Solo, ever the reluctant hero, used his influence and smuggling expertise to reconnect trade routes disrupted by the Empire. Chewbacca provided protection and assistance for missions too dangerous for normal patrols. Even characters like Lando Calrissian played a part in rebuilding the galaxy's economy, helping re-establish trade and investment in key systems. Together, these familiar faces created a network of leadership, guidance, and hope. The galaxy threw a party that probably lasted a year. For the first time in decades, people could speak their minds without a guy in white armor listening in. The rebels, now calling themselves the New Republic, were in charge. Their leader, Mon Mothma, became the first Chancellor, and she made one decision that echoes through everything that comes next: demilitarization. The New Republic looked at the Empire and said their biggest weapon was their military. So if we get rid of ours, that can never happen again. It was a beautiful, idealistic, and utterly naive thought. They passed the Military Disarmament Act. They started taking apart Star Destroyers. The fleet that beat the Empire? Reduced to a tiny fraction of its former self. What was left was called the New Republic Defense Fleet, and its main job was humanitarian aid and showing the flag. They genuinely believed that good intentions and democracy were enough to keep everyone safe. They thought the galaxy was tired of fighting. For a lot of people, especially in the core worlds like Chandrila, Hosnian Prime, the new capital, fancy right, and Corellia, this was a genuine golden age. The economy was booming, trade routes were open. You could start a business without 20 forms of Imperial permission. Art and culture exploded. If you were a baker on Hosnian Prime or a tech worker on Corellia, life was good. The war was a bad dream, and the future looked bright. But that's the core for you. It's always been the galaxy's gated community. They're insulated from the real problems. You take one step into the mid-rim, and especially the outer rim, and the picture gets dark real quick. The Empire's collapse left a power vacuum you could fly a superstar destroyer through. What fills a void like that? Warlords, gangsters, pirates. The Imperial remnant didn't vanish. The smart ones, the true believers, didn't stick around to sign surrender papers. They grabbed their ships, their guns, and their fanaticism and ran for the outer rim. They set themselves up as petty warlords, controlling a system or two, shaking down locals, and still calling themselves moffs and admirals. They were bullies with leftover Imperial gear, and the criminal underworld? Business had never been better. The Hutts, the Pike Syndicate, all those guys. They expanded like crazy. With no big government to push back, smuggling, spice running, and slavery went through the roof. For the average person on a planet like Tatooine or some remote mining world, nothing really changed. The Imperial boot on their neck was replaced by a Hutt's tail or a pirate's blaster. And when they sent a message to the New Republic asking for help, the response was slow, bogged down in bureaucracy, and totally useless. The Senate felt a million miles away. This is where the politics get messy, and honestly, it's the most frustrating part. The New Republic Senate was completely paralyzed by two factions: the populists and the centrists. The populists, led by people like Princess Leia Organa, wanted a loose, decentralized republic. They remembered how Palpatine used a strong central government to grab power, so they argued that individual planets should hold most of the power. A weak central government that only handled the big stuff. Their hearts were in the right place, but their plan left the Republic with no teeth. The centrists argued for a stronger central government and a stronger military. They pointed to the chaos in the Outer Rim and said, "See, we need to be able to actually do something." But the truth is that a lot of the centrists were secretly Imperial sympathizers. They missed the order of the Empire. Some had gotten rich under it. Some truly believed a firm hand was the only way to rule. They talked a good game about the New Republic, but behind the scenes, they were often sabotaging any effort to get anything done. So every time Leia stood up and said, "Hey, I'm hearing whispers about something big and scary building in the unknown regions. We should check that out," the centrists would shut her down. They called her a warmonger. They said she was trying to create a new empire with herself as the Empress. The Senate would argue and debate until the whole thing fizzled out. And that, something big and scary, was the birth of the First Order. While the New Republic was busy arguing, the most fanatical remnants of the Empire, led by people like Grand Admiral Ray Sloane and Brendol Hux, had fled into the unknown regions. They took the Empire's best tech, its brightest scientists, and its most ruthless ideologues, and they started over. They learned from Palpatine's mistakes. They built a new, fanatical, and unbelievably well-equipped military in total secret. They called it the First Order. This wasn't a remnant, it was a brand new enemy, designed from the ground up to be more efficient and more terrifying than the Empire ever was. They were funding it. A lot of historians point to secret back-channel funding from those centrist senators and their wealthy buddies as the lifeblood of the First Order's massive projects. The New Republic was literally paying for its own destruction through political infighting and corruption. The final nail in the coffin for any hope of the New Republic getting its act together was the scandal that broke Leia Organa. Her political enemies dug up her deepest secret and blasted it across the galaxy. She was the daughter of Darth Vader. Overnight, the galaxy's greatest hero became an object of suspicion and fear. How could the daughter of the most evil man alive be trusted? Her credibility was vaporized. The centrists used it to paint her as a dangerous radical. Seeing the political process was hopeless, Leia made her move. She resigned from the Senate. She reached out to veterans, commanders, and Outer Rim leaders who knew the First Order was real. She formed a private military force. They weren't the New Republic army. They were something smaller, grittier, more desperate. They called themselves the Resistance. The New Republic mostly tolerated them, some senators even secretly funneling them a bit of cash and old gear, but officially the government looked the other way. They refused to admit the problem was real. Life for a regular person in this era was a tale of two galaxies. If you lived in the core worlds, life was probably great. You had peace, prosperity, and freedom. The First Order was a wild conspiracy theory on the HoloNet. The Resistance was a bunch of paranoid extremists causing trouble. You went to your job, you raised your family, you enjoyed the peace, you were living in the calm before the storm, and you had no clue the storm was coming. If you lived in the Outer Rim, life was hard, chaotic, and dangerous. You were on your own. The New Republic was a joke, a bunch of politicians in a fancy building who didn't care if you lived or died. Your daily life was about avoiding pirate raids, dealing with local warlords, and trying to scrape together enough credits to eat. You learned to rely on yourself and your community, because nobody else was coming. The entire late New Republic era was built on a beautiful lie. The lie that you could win a war with courage and then maintain the peace with good feelings. The lie that the enemy was truly gone. It was an era of incredible willful blindness, where the government chose comfort and political games over facing a hard, ugly truth. It was the most peaceful and prosperous the galaxy had been in generations, and it was all about to be obliterated because they forgot the most important rule. Peace isn't a default state. It's something you have to protect every single day. They got comfortable. And in the Star Wars galaxy, comfort is the first and last mistake. Alright, let's rewind the clock. If the late New Republic era felt like a gilded cage, pretty on the outside, kinda shaky underneath, then the Separatist crisis is that moment you smell smoke, but can't find the fire. Everyone's arguing, no one's actually looking for the flames, and the guy who started it is standing in the corner smiling. This is the prelude to the Clone Wars. And man, it's a masterclass in how to break a galaxy without throwing a single punch. At least, not at first. To understand why this crisis worked, you have to first understand just how rotten the Galactic Republic had become. We're not talking about a few corrupt senators. We're talking about a system where corruption wasn't the exception. It was the operating system. The Senate on Coruscant was a glorified marketplace. Votes weren't won by debate. They were purchased with campaign contributions, lucrative contracts, and promises of favor. Lobbyists for the mega corporations, the Trade Federation, the Commerce Guild, the Techno Union, the banking clan, had more real power than most planetary representatives. They could stall legislation, redirect funds, and strangle entire sectors with regulations they themselves helped write. The Republic wasn't being run by politicians, it was being administered by corporate interests. This created a brutal, two-tiered galaxy. The core worlds, Coruscant, Alderaan, Corellia, lived in a bubble of prosperity. They were the beneficiaries of this system. Their economies boomed, their culture flourished, and the messy business of resource extraction happened far, far away, out of sight and out of mind. But if you lived in the Outer Rim, on a planet like Ryloth, or a mineral-rich moon in the mid-rim, your entire reality was defined by exploitation. Your hyperlanes were patrolled and taxed by the Trade Federation. Your resources were extracted by off-world corporations that paid your government a pittance and left you with poisoned land and empty mines. Your petitions for aid, for representation, for basic infrastructure were lost in the bureaucratic labyrinth of the Senate. You were a colony in all but name, and the feeling of resentment wasn't political. It was a generational, deeply personal bitterness. This is the tinderbox, and into it steps Count Dooku. Now, Dooku is a fascinating and tragic figure. He wasn't some fringe radical. He was Jedi Master Dooku. He sat on the Jedi Council. He was the master of Qui-Gon Jinn. He was an insider's insider, respected and connected, and he became utterly disillusioned. He looked at the Jedi Order and saw them as lapdogs of a corrupt government, too entangled in politics to see their own diminishing light. He looked at the Republic and saw a hollowed-out corpse. When he left the Order and returned to his ancestral title as Count of Sereno, he didn't only retire, he began a crusade. His genius was his pitch. He spoke with the eloquence and gravity of a philosopher. He gave voice to that simmering resentment in the Outer Rim. He argued that the Republic was not merely flawed, it was irredeemable. That the only path to true justice, self-determination, and prosperity was a complete divorce. Secession. He proposed a new government, the Confederacy of Independent Systems. It was a powerful, seductive idea. For the first time, someone important was saying, "You are right to be angry, and there is another way." But Dooku was only the face. The architect was Darth Sidious. Palpatine, from his office as senator, and then Chancellor of the very Republic he was undermining, was pulling every string. He was Dooku's Sith Master, guiding his every move. Sidious understood that idealism alone wouldn't break the galaxy. So the second part of the plan was the recruitment of the Megacourse. Sidious, through Dooku, went to the Neimoidian leaders of the Trade Federation. They were still humiliated and financially bruised from their failed invasion of Naboo and subsequent Republic sanctions. He offered them a clean slate, join the Confederacy, and operate with total impunity. No taxes, no regulations, no annoying Republic oversight. Pure, unfettered capitalism. He went to the Geonosians, the brilliant but insectoid engineers led by Archduke Poggle the Lesser. They cared little for politics, but loved two things: building and isolation. Dooku offered them contracts to build the greatest droid army the galaxy had ever seen, and a promise that the new Confederacy would leave their hive world alone. He went to the intergalactic banking clan, led by the Moon San Hill. Banking is all about stability and profit. The Republic's instability was bad for business. Dooku offered them a new, stable, profitable power base, with the chance to literally bankroll both sides of the coming conflict for maximum gain. These corporations didn't only bring money, they brought armies. The Trade Federation's droid armies, the Bactoid Armor Workshop's droidekas, the Geonosians' droid factories. The Confederacy was a military-industrial complex from day one. This created a bizarre and powerful coalition. The Confederacy was a messy, contradictory alliance. It contained genuine idealists, like the philosophers of Raxus Secundus, who believed in the principle of self-rule. It contained pragmatic planetary governments who saw it as the only viable economic path. And it contained amoral corporate barons who saw it as the ultimate profit-making opportunity. They were united only by their opposition to Coruscant. This inherent instability was a feature, not a bug, for Sidious. It made the Confederacy ultimately controllable and utterly expendable. The Republic's response was a case study in institutional failure. The Senate was paralysed, debates were endless and circular. The political landscape split into two camps. On one side, the Doves, led by senators like Padme Amidala of Naboo and Bail Organa of Alderaan. They argued for diplomacy, for addressing the root causes of the secessionist sentiment, for de-escalation. They truly believed the Republic's ideals could win the day. On the other side were the Hawks, who grew louder with each passing crisis. They were led by Chancellor Palpatine himself, though he always played the reluctant leader pushed into action by circumstance. He and his allies spoke of security, of strength, of the need to protect the Republic from this unprovoked aggression. He let others call for a military solution, while he merely nodded sadly. Caught in the middle were the Jedi. This era is the beginning of their end. Their role became hopelessly confused. They were sent as mediators to disputes that were engineered to fail. They were peacekeepers being asked to keep the peace between one side with legitimate grievances and another side that was utterly corrupt. You can feel their frustration. The Force itself was becoming clouded, murky. They could feel a great disturbance, a gathering darkness, but they couldn't see its source. They were generals without an army, diplomats whose authority was crumbling, and monks who were being dragged deeper into the gutter of politics every day. Masters like Mace Windu grew increasingly stern and distrustful, while others like Ki-Adi-Mundi struggled to apply Jedi doctrine to a situation that was fundamentally un-Jedi, and all the while, the ultimate weapon was being prepared. On a storm-racked planet beyond Republic records, the clone army was growing. This is Sidious's masterpiece of manipulation. He had a Jedi master, Sifo Dyas, who foresaw a coming darkness and, in a moment of desperate renegade insight, commissioned the army. Sidious had him killed, took control of the project, and erased all traces of it. For a decade, the Kaminoans bred and trained this perfect obedient army in total secrecy. It was a ghost, a myth, and it was designed to be discovered at the perfect moment, presented as a miraculous salvation that would immediately militarize the Republic and place the Jedi at the head of a war machine. For the average citizen, this decade-long crisis was a slow, grinding anxiety. In the core worlds, it started with headlines. News of another system seceding, debates on the HoloNet. Then came the economic impacts. Trade routes became insecure. Pirate attacks, often secretly encouraged by one side or the other, skyrocketed. The price of goods began to climb. A sense of unease settled over once comfortable worlds. People started to feel that their prosperous, stable lives were more fragile than they thought. In the Outer Rim, it was outright chaos and often violence. Planets were forced to choose sides. This choice often split communities and even families. A brother might believe in the ideal of the Republic, while a sister saw the Confederacy as their only hope. Pro-Republic and pro-Separatist militias clashed in the streets. If a major corporation picked your planet for a strategic resource extraction, they didn't ask. They landed with droids and took over. You were either with them or you were buried. The Jedi were too few to help. The Republic judicial forces were nowhere to be seen. This is the true tragedy of the Separatist crisis. It was built on a foundation of very real, very legitimate problems. The Republic was corrupt, the Outer Rim was exploited. Dooku's initial message resonated because it was true. But that truth was hijacked, weaponized, and amplified by a Sith Lord who used that righteous anger to fuel a war that would ultimately doom everyone involved, Separatist and Republican alike. You want to talk about a raw deal? Being born at the very start of the Clone Wars is like your parents bringing you home from the hospital, and the first thing you see is some Jedi with a blue laser sword standing on a beach, getting absolutely shelled by artillery. That's like winning the lottery, but the prize is a lifetime supply of anxiety and a front row seat to the galaxy slowly losing its mind. This isn't the clean, noble conflict the propaganda machines churned out. The early years of the Clone Wars were a chaotic, brutal, and confusing mess where the entire concept of peace was put on a shelf and forgotten about. It was the galaxy learning how to fight a modern war again, and the learning curve was paid for in blood and credits. It all exploded on Geonosis, but the explosion was way messier than anyone admits. The footage shows the Jedi making their brave stand, and the clones arriving like a miraculous cavalry. What it doesn't show is the sheer, unadulterated chaos. Jedi, who had spent centuries as diplomats and philosophers, were suddenly thrust into the heart of a full-scale battle. They were getting cut down by concentrated blaster fire, overwhelmed by numbers they couldn't possibly deflect. The arena was a slaughterhouse. The subsequent battle across the Geonosian plains was the first ever clash between the droid army and the clone army, and it was a brutal learning experience for both sides. Tactics were made up on the fly. The clones, for all their training, were experiencing real combat for the first time. The sound wasn't of heroic music. It was the relentless clank, clank, clank of droids marching, the scream of incoming artillery, and the static-filled comms of troopers calling out positions. Geonosis wasn't a victory, it was a statement. a statement that the galaxy was now a battlefield. And just like that, the Republic had to become a war machine. Overnight, imagine a government that hadn't fielded a real army in a millennium suddenly needing to fund, supply, and command the largest military force in history. The economic shift was staggering. Core world planets like Kuat and Fondor became the engine of the war effort. Their massive shipyards, which once produced luxury liners and bulk freighters, were retooled. The air was filled with the constant roar of machinery and the blinding light of welding torches as they pumped out Acclamator-class assault ships and Venator-class star destroyers. It was all hands on deck. Civilian engineers became military contractors. Resource allocation was redirected on a galactic scale. Dunium for hull plating, Tibanna gas for blaster cartridges, food supplies for the massive army. Everything was prioritized for the Grand Army of the Republic. Back on Coruscant, the government started selling war bonds. Invest in the Republic's future, the ads would say. Taxes were raised. Rationing began on certain goods. The message was clear: your comfort is secondary to the war effort. This new reality was made visible by the clones themselves. Before the war, they were a rumor, a secret. Now, they were everywhere. You'd see them marching in formation through the spaceports of Coruscant, their white armor a stark contrast to the vibrant civilian life. They stood guard outside power stations, patrolled government districts, and provided security for hyperspace docking rings. Their presence was constant, a physical reminder that the galaxy was no longer at peace. And people had to grapple with that. These were identical men, born and bred to fight, with no past and a future that was almost certainly short and brutal. It created a weird, uncomfortable social dynamic. They were the heroes on the HoloNet newsreels, but on the street they were a walking, talking symbol of a terrifying new normal. For the average civilian, the war was a spectrum of experience. In the core worlds, life was militarized but relatively safe. The war was something you saw on the news. You lived with rationing, with the constant background hum of patriotic propaganda, and with the fear that a separatist raid could, however unlikely, break through. You might have a family member who enlisted in the Republic's auxiliary forces, not as a clone, but as a volunteer soldier, sailor, or pilot. But in the mid and outer rim, you were on the front lines. Your planet could be a target for its resources, its hyperlane location, or simply because it was in the way. Life was a constant calculation of risk. You learned the difference between the scream of a vulture droid and the roar of a V-19 Torrent starfighter. The concept of home became fragile. One day, your town is quiet. The next, it's a battlefield between advancing droids and defending clones. You became an expert in basement shelters, emergency supplies, and hoping the fighting passed you by. The war wasn't a news story. It was the dirt on your hands and the fear in your throat. The battles of the early war weren't the grand strategic campaigns that came later. They were brutal, grinding affairs over objectives that often seemed abstract to anyone not holding a datapad with a tactical readout. Take the Battle of Christophsis. On the surface, it was about a planet known for its valuable crystalline resources. In reality, it became a brutal lesson in urban warfare and attrition. The Separatists, under the command of the cunning Admiral Trench, had laid a masterful siege. Republic forces, led by Obi-Wan Kenobi and a young Anakin Skywalker, found themselves not in an open field, but in a shattered cityscape. Fighting was house to house, street to street. Clones used rubble for cover, setting up sniper positions in broken towers, while droids marched relentlessly down thoroughfares, their blaster fire chipping away at the city. It was a dirty, exhausting fight. Then there was the Battle of Ryloth. This was where the true cost of liberation became horrifyingly clear. The Separatists, led by Wat Tambor of the Techno Union, didn't just invade Ryloth, they enslaved it. They imposed a brutal blockade, starving the Twi'lek population into submission and forcing them to work in mines and factories. When the Republic arrived, it wasn't a simple matter of defeating a droid army. They had to break the blockade, which meant Venators slugging it out with Munificent-class star frigates in a chaotic naval engagement. Then they had to land forces and engage in a ground campaign against dug-in droid positions. ATTE walkers shelled cliffsides, where droids had set up artillery. Clone troopers engaged in vicious close-quarters combat to free concentration camps, and the Twi'leks themselves were caught in the middle. Their planet was being ripped apart to save it. Cities were bombarded, landscapes were scarred by laser fire, and for every droid destroyed, a family's home was often collateral damage. The Jedi, like Mace Windu who led the ground assault, had to make terrible choices. Do you destroy a droid command center if it's located in a residential district? The early war was full of these impossible decisions. This pressure cooker is where we see our iconic characters being forged, and not always for the better. Obi-Wan Kenobi earned his reputation as the negotiator, but the war forced him to become so much more. He was a brilliant strategist, a calm and collected commander under fire. But you could see the war sanding away his edges. The witty diplomat was becoming a weary soldier, his idealism tempered by the grim reality of command. Every decision he made had a body count attached to it. Anakin Skywalker was, in many ways, the perfect weapon for this kind of war. His unpredictability, his raw power, and his instinctual grasp of tactics made him a nightmare for the Separatists. He was the hero with no fear, and the Republic propaganda machine loved him for it. But the war was the worst possible environment for him. It rewarded his recklessness. It fed his need for dramatic, decisive action. Every time he broke the rules, ignored a direct order, and pulled off a miraculous victory, it reinforced his darkest impulses. That his power put him above the rules, that the ends justified any means. The Jedi Council depended on his victories, even as they grew more and more apprehensive about the methods he used to achieve them. The war was actively corrupting him, turning his passion into a raging fire. And then there was Ahsoka Tano. Thrown into the deep end as Anakin's Padawan, her entire Jedi upbringing was the Clone Wars. She didn't learn lightsaber forms in the tranquil halls of the temple. She learned them deflecting blaster bolts on a battlefield. Her connection to the war was unique. While the Jedi generals often saw the clones as soldiers, Ahsoka, through her close friendship with Captain Rex of the 501st Legion, saw them as people. She understood their humor, their fears, their individuality. She represented a new, war-born generation of Jedi, one that was more soldier than monk, and her journey was a constant struggle to hold on to her compassion in the face of unrelenting violence. The clones themselves are the undeniable, tragic heart of this story. Units like the 501st, Vader's Fist, or the 212th Attack Battalion became legendary. We remember names like Captain Rex, Commander Cody, and the brave troopers of the 104th Battalion who served under Jedi Master Plo Koon. They fought with unparalleled bravery, ingenuity, and loyalty. But we must never forget, they were slaves. They were genetically engineered to be obedient, to find purpose in combat, and to die for a republic that most of them would never get to experience as free citizens. They fought for each other, for their Jedi commanders, but they never had a choice in the matter. Their heroism is underscored by a profound tragedy. The early Clone Wars were a time of terrifying transformation. The galaxy was learning how to fight again, and the lessons were written in fire and blood. The Republic was shedding its democratic skin, becoming a centralized, militarized state. The Jedi were losing their way, trading lightsabers for military strategy, and at the center of it all, the clones fought and died, the immortal soldiers in a war that was slowly consuming the soul of the galaxy. It was a brutal, unforgiving time to be alive, a prelude to an even darker chapter waiting just around the corner. The rise of the Empire. It's the moment the galaxy collectively took a wrong turn down a dark alley and found a Sith Lord waiting at the other end. If you thought the Clone Wars were rough, buckle up. This is where hope goes to die, trust becomes a liability, and the entire concept of democracy gets thrown out the airlock without a spacesuit. The Clone Wars are dragging into their third year. Everyone's exhausted. The clones are tired of watching their brothers die. The Jedi are stretched so thin they're basically using force speed just to get from one crisis to another. Civilians are sick of rationing and blackout curtains and holonet news filled with casualty reports. The Republic is winning. Technically, but it doesn't feel like winning. It feels like slowly bleeding out. The Separatists are on the back foot, but they're still putting up a fight, and every battle costs something. The air in the galaxy is thick with fatigue, and this desperate, fragile hope that maybe the end is near. And in the middle of all this, you've got Chancellor Palpatine. This guy has been playing 4D chess while everyone else is struggling with checkers. While the Jedi were off playing general, he's been in his office, quietly weaving the biggest web of power the galaxy has ever seen. The Senate, scared out of their minds and desperate for stability, has been handing him emergency powers like candy. Need to approve a new fleet? Emergency power. Need to fast-track troop deployments? Emergency power. Need to regulate the price of blue milk? You get the idea. Bit by bit, he's been dismantling the checks and balances of the Republic, and nobody even noticed because they were too busy cheering for the strong leader who promised to keep them safe. The democracy they were fighting for was already on life support. Palpatine was just waiting for the right moment to pull the plug. Now, let's talk about the Jedi, because their story here is a straight-up tragedy. They're in an impossible spot. They're warriors leading our army, but they're also peacekeepers. Their connection to the Force is all fuzzy and staticky. They're suspicious of Palpatine. How could they not be? The man has more power than any Chancellor in history, and the war just keeps dragging on. But every time they try to investigate, they hit a wall. They're stuck. And then there's Anakin Skywalker, the Republic's golden boy, the hero with no fear. But underneath that hero exterior, he's a mess. He's arrogant, he's angry, he's deeply insecure, and he's having nightmares about his wife, Padme, dying in childbirth. He's terrified of loss, and Palpatine has been grooming him for years, playing the kindly mentor, the father figure he never had. Palpatine listens to him, validates his frustrations, tells him he's special, that the Jedi don't appreciate him. It's a classic manipulation, and Anakin, emotionally desperate and powerful beyond belief, is the perfect target. The climax of this mess happens in Palpatine's office. The Jedi have finally figured out he's the Sith Lord they've been looking for, thanks to a less than stealthy arrest attempt by Mace Windu. Then, I think you already know the story. I don't think we can ever really emphasize how horrifying Order 66 is. This was cold, calculated genocide programmed into the clones from day one. A secret command buried in their inhibitor chips, waiting for a single code to activate. The moment Palpatine gives the order, it's like a switch flips in the brains of every single clone trooper across the galaxy. Put yourself in a Jedi's boots for a second. You're on some backwater planet like Megiddo or Felucia. You've just fought through a brutal campaign with your clone battalion. You trust these men. You've shared rations with them. You've joked with them. You've mourned their fallen brothers. The battle is over. You're turning your back to them, maybe calling for a medevac for your wounded, thinking about getting some rest. And then you hear the blaster shot. It's not even a battle, it's an assassination. Jedi Masters like Plo Koon, who was flying his fighter, gets shot down by his own wingman. Ayla Secura is gunned down from behind by the troopers she just led to victory. Ki Adi Mundi is surrounded and executed in the mud. The Jedi are caught completely off guard. The clones, for their part, aren't evil. They're victims too. Their free will is literally overridden by a biochip. They're puppets, forced to murder their friends without understanding why. Meanwhile, on Coruscant, the heart of the Jedi Order is being torn out. Anakin, now Vader, leads the 501st Legion, his personal troops, into the Jedi Temple. They sweep through the halls, gunning down everyone. Jedi, Padawans, younglings, librarians, all cooked. The temple, a beacon of light and knowledge for millennia, becomes a charnel house. It's not a military action, it's extermination. While this is happening, Palpatine is on the Senate podium, putting on the performance of a lifetime. He's the picture of grief-stricken resolve. He tells the Senate that the Jedi, in a treacherous plot, attempted to overthrow the Republic and assassinate him. He sells it completely. He uses the Jedi's own role as generals against them. They amassed our army and turned it against us. The Senate, terrified and desperate for someone to make the bad things stop, believes him. They cheer when he announces that the Republic will be reorganized into the first galactic empire. For a safe and secure society, they're cheering for their own prison warden. The irony is so thick you could land a Star Destroyer on it. And just like that, the Empire is born. The transition is terrifyingly seamless. The clone troopers become the first stormtroopers. Their armor gets a new paint job, but the men inside are the same, for now. The vast military-industrial complex built for the war now serves the Emperor. The bureaucracy doesn't skip a beat. It just gets a new logo. For the average citizen on a core world, life doesn't change overnight. The war is over. That's all that matters. The HoloNet is flooded with propaganda about peace, order, and the treacherous Jedi. People are relieved. They don't see the boot coming down. They just see the end of the explosions. But the signs are there immediately, if you know where to look. The Senate is kept around as a pretty talking shop, but it has no real power. Palpatine rules by decree. Planetary governors, called Moffs, are appointed to rule sectors with military authority. Dissent is not just discouraged, it's crushed. Planets that protest or resist are made examples of. The fear that was used to fight the Separatists is now turned inward, to control the Empire's own citizens. And what happens to our heroes? They're shattered. Obi-Wan Kenobi, after a brutal lightsaber duel with his former brother on Mustafar that leaves Anakin mutilated and burning, goes into exile on Tatooine. His job? Watch over Anakin's son, Luke, from a distance. The great General Kenobi is reduced to a lonely hermit, known as Ben, a crazy old man who talks about wizards. The weight of his failure is his only companion. Yoda, after fighting Palpatine himself and losing, retreats to the swamp planet of Dagobah. He goes to wait and to die, in a place strong with the dark side, to hide his presence. The Grand Master of the Jedi Order is alone with his grief for a fallen order. Padme Amidala, the heart of the rebellion in waiting, dies. The medical droids say she lost the will to live. It's heartbreaking. She gives birth to twins, Luke and Leia, and her last act is to believe there's still good in Anakin. She's one of the only ones who never gives up on him, even as he's choking her out. And Anakin? He's saved by Palpatine, but the cost is everything. He's put in a horrifying life support suit of black armor. It keeps him alive, but it's a constant prison of pain, his breathing a mechanical rasp. He's no longer Anakin Skywalker. He's Darth Vader, the Emperor's fist. His first mission? Hunt down and exterminate the remaining Jedi. He's forced to murder the very people he once called family to prove his loyalty. It's the ultimate corruption. The rise of the Empire is the ultimate cautionary tale. It's about how a democracy can be voted out of existence. It's about how fear can make people surrender their freedom for the illusion of safety. It's about the cost of silence and the price of looking the other way. It's a story of betrayal so deep it echoes for generations. And the scariest part? For a lot of people, it didn't feel like a tragedy. It felt like a new beginning. And that is the most terrifying thought of all. Alright, so the Empire is officially in charge. The cheering in the Senate has died down. The last of the confetti from the declaration of a new order has been swept away, and now it's Tuesday. And let me tell you, Tuesdays under the Empire are the worst. This is the boring, terrifying, everyday reality of living under a boot. The dark times. It's a literal description of a galaxy where the lights are slowly, systematically being turned off. First, the military transition. The clone army is being systematically retired. Think about that. Millions of identical men, bred for one purpose, who just won a galactic war. And what's their reward? Being put out to pasture. The official line is that they're being phased out due to advanced aging and a desire to create a more diverse military structure. The reality is they're a reminder of the old Republic. They're expensive to maintain, and they're a bit too independent for Palpatine's taste. Some are transferred to training cadres to whip the new recruits into shape. Others are sent to far-flung backwater posts to quietly serve out their shortened lives. Many just disappear. It's a quiet, inglorious end for the army that saved the Republic only to be used to destroy it. Their replacements are the new Stormtrooper Corps. These aren't clones, they're volunteers and conscripts. Kids from poor core world families looking for a steady job and 3 square meals a day. Ambitious young men and women from the mid-rim who buy into the Imperial propaganda and want to see the galaxy. Their training is brutal, designed to strip away individuality and instill absolute loyalty to the chain of command and the Emperor. They're not soldiers, they're cogs. The iconic white armor isn't for their protection, it's a uniform. It makes them anonymous, interchangeable, a symbol of the faceless, relentless power of the state. And because they're everywhere, that symbol becomes part of the background noise of life. You get used to seeing them on street corners, in spaceports, patrolling markets. Their presence is a constant low-level reminder you are being watched. And who's doing the real watching? Meet the Imperial Security Bureau, the ISB. If the stormtroopers are the boot, the ISB is the eye behind the camera that tells the boot where to step. This is where the Empire's paranoia gets a budget and a badge. ISB agents are the ultimate bureaucrats of control. They're smart, they're patient, and they're everywhere. They monitor everything: public comms traffic, private financial transactions, shipping manifests, energy consumption on a planetary level. They have algorithms that flag seditious patterns, a neighborhood with slightly lower power usage on Empire Day, a cantina that plays music from a world with separatist sympathies, a group of friends who meet too regularly. They recruit informants at every level of society. That guy who's always complaining about his taxes but suddenly stops, he might be an informant. Your chatty co-worker who always seems a little too interested in your opinions on the latest Imperial decree, probably an informant. The fear the ISB cultivates isn't a loud fear. It's a quiet, pervasive one. It's the fear that makes you second-guess a joke before you tell it, that makes you change the subject when a stranger sits down next to you, that makes you worry about what your own children might repeat at school. This atmosphere is sustained by a propaganda machine that would make any historical dictator weep with joy. The HoloNet is now Galactic Empire News Network, and it's a 24/7 loop of Imperial glory. Every broadcast is a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. The segments are slickly produced. There's the news, which always portrays the Empire as a benevolent force bringing order to chaotic worlds. There are dramas about heroic stormtroopers saving colonists from vile pirates, conveniently ignoring that the Empire often is the pirate. There are children's cartoons with adorable animated TIE fighters fighting off clumsy, foolish creatures that look suspiciously like Wookiees or Mon Calamari. The messaging is relentless and simple. The past was bad, the Old Republic was weak, corrupt, and chaotic. The Jedi were treacherous villains. The Clone Wars were a terrible tragedy that the Emperor ended. The present is secure. Thanks to the Emperor's wisdom and the strength of the Imperial military, the galaxy is safe. Trade routes are open for approved Imperial shipping. Piracy is at an all-time low because dissidents are labelled pirates and shot. The future is bright. Through unity and obedience, we will reach new heights of peace and prosperity. Any hardship is a temporary necessity on the path to this glorious future. It's inescapable. It's on every public screen, taught in every school, echoed by every approved official. After a while, even if you know it's nonsense, a small part of you starts to believe it. It's just easier. It's cognitive dissonance on a galactic scale. Meanwhile, the Empire is also playing a longer economic game. This is where the carrot comes in, but it's a carrot on a very, very long stick. The Imperial military-industrial complex is the largest employer in the galaxy. Kuat drive yards, Sienna fleet systems, Blastech Industries, they're all working triple shifts. They need engineers, welders, technicians, programmers, and janitors. For a lot of people, on core worlds like Coruscant, Corellia, or even recently pacified worlds, the Empire means jobs, stable jobs, a chance to provide for your family. But the cost is complicity. You might be a brilliant engineer who just loves the challenge of designing a new TIE fighter engine. You're not thinking about the fact that your engine will power a fighter that will glass a village on a world that refused a mining permit. You're just solving an interesting problem and collecting a paycheck. The Empire expertly ties the economic well-being of millions to its own military expansion. Your livelihood depends on the war machine, so you have a vested interest in not asking too many questions. You become a passive participant in the system. For the Outer Rim, it's not even a carrot, it's just the stick. The Empire's thirst for resources is insatiable. Worlds like Lothal, which are rich in dunium and other minerals, are effectively colonized. Imperial surveyors show up, then mining guilds, then a permanent garrison. Farmland is seized for refineries. Ancient sacred lands are strip-mined. The local population is given a choice: work for the Empire in the mines for a pittance, or be labelled insurrectionists and be removed. This is where Grand Moff Tarkin's doctrine of rule by fear is applied in its purest form. The goal isn't to win loyalty, it's to crush hope. The destruction of Alderaan is the ultimate expression of this. But years before that, there were countless smaller Alderaans. Worlds like Larson, where the Lasat were nearly exterminated with a brutal new weapon, the T7 Ion Disruptor. The message was sent: resistance is not futile, it is extinct. So, what is daily life like for an average, non-heroic person during the dark times? It's a life of quiet accommodation. It's learning to navigate 1,000 tiny rules. It's being off the streets by a certain hour, unless you have an approved work permit, needing a mountain of documentation to travel between sectors, each one an opportunity for an ISB agent to deny you and ask why you want to leave anyway. Learning to use the approved terms. They're not stormtroopers. They're Imperial peacekeepers. It's not an occupation, it's a stabilization presence. The most important skill you develop is knowing when to be quiet. You see something you shouldn't. You hear something seditious. You look the other way. You don't know anything. You didn't see anything. This is the crushing weight of the dark times. It's not one big thing. It's the cumulative effect of a million small cuts to your freedom, your dignity, and your spirit. The galaxy becomes a colder, quieter, less colourful place. Music becomes more subdued. Art becomes less challenging. Conversation becomes more guarded. And this is the most important thing, this is also where the rebellion is truly born, not as a military alliance, but as a feeling. These aren't organised cells, they're sparks, isolated, fragile, and easily snuffed out, but there are millions of them. The Empire, in its relentless effort to impose total control, creates its own opposition. By trying to extinguish all light, it makes every tiny spark of defiance shine all the brighter. The dark times are the period where the Empire, believing it has won forever, is actually planting the seeds of its own destruction. It's making everyone in the galaxy answer a simple, terrifying question. What are you willing to endure? Now the Jedi. First, let's just sit for a second and imagine what it was like to be a Jedi who survived Order 66. Everyone you've ever known is dead. The institution you dedicated your life to is ashes. The very government you fought for has put a price on your head so large it could buy a small moon. And the clones you called brothers? They're the ones who tried to kill you. The survivors didn't have a support group. They scattered to the solar winds and had to figure it out alone. Their stories are some of the most tragic in the whole galaxy, but not everyone could just hide. Some Jedi couldn't turn it off. They tried to fight back, but they were alone. They became smugglers, bounty hunters, wandering medics, anything to stay off the grid and maybe do a little good where they could. These were the most paranoid beings alive. Every shadow could be an ISB agent. Every casual conversation was a potential trap. They had to suppress everything that made them Jedi. The constant fear, the isolation, it broke a lot of them. Some just gave up and faded away. Others got sloppy and were found. And that's where the hunters come in, because the Empire knew that a few Jedi had slipped through the net. Regular stormtroopers and ISB agents aren't equipped to find a trained Force user who doesn't want to be found. So Palpatine and Vader created a very specific, very nasty solution. The Inquisitors are maybe the most messed up concept the Empire ever came up with. And that's a high bar. They weren't Sith. There can only be two of those. And Palpatine wasn't sharing power. They were something else. They were former Jedi themselves. Padawans, mostly. Young, vulnerable kids who were captured after Order 66. Instead of killing them, Vader and Palpatine tortured them, broke their minds, and twisted them to the dark side. They turned the Jedi's own against them. Think about the psychological horror of that. You're an Inquisitor. Your entire identity is hunting down the very people who were once your teachers, your friends, your creche mates. You're a walking, talking monument to the Empire's total victory. They were given a brutal education in the dark side, enough to make them dangerous, but not enough to ever challenge Vader. Their spinning, double-bladed lightsabers were a mockery of the Jedi weapon, just like they were a mockery of the Jedi themselves. They were tools, and they knew it. They lived in constant fear of failure, because failure meant being replaced by the very Jedi they were hunting, or by Vader himself. They were the bogeymen. Their job was to travel the galaxy, following whispers of Force-sensitive children or rumors of a Jedi sighting. They'd descend on a world like a plague, and their methods were thorough. They didn't just want to kill the Jedi, they wanted to exterminate any memory of them, and they loved their work. And looming over the entire operation, the final, unstoppable authority was Darth Vader. The Inquisitors were the hunting dogs. but Vader was the master. He wasn't involved in the day-to-day chase. He was the consequence. If an Inquisitor failed, Vader would show up to clean up the mess, and usually the Inquisitor too. He was the Empire's ultimate terror weapon. His very name was whispered. For a surviving Jedi, hearing that Vader was in system wasn't a threat. It was a death sentence. There was no fighting him, no hiding from him, no bargaining. He was the end of the line. This Shadow War defined the dark times for anyone connected to the Force. It was a relentless, paranoid game of cat and mouse, where the mice were traumatized survivors and the cats were their own tortured, fallen friends. It was a war of whispers and fear, fought in the forgotten corners of the galaxy, far from the eyes of the ordinary citizens just trying to get by. And it ensured that the light of the Jedi wouldn't just be extinguished, but that anyone who tried to rekindle it would be hunted to the edge of the galaxy. Alright, let's talk about the First Order. Because if the Empire was the galaxy's toxic ex who left a bunch of their stuff in your garage, the First Order is that ex's kid who shows up 10 years later, having spent their entire trust fund on black armor and military-grade weapons, and is now screaming in your driveway about how they're going to finish what their parents started. It's a story of failure, amnesia, and the galaxy's most expensive and destructive temper tantrum. To really get how this happened, we have to rewind to the aftermath of the Battle of Endor, and, more importantly, the Battle of Jakku. Jakku was the Empire's last stand. After that, what was left of the Imperial leadership signed the Galactic Concordance. This was basically their formal surrender. The terms were strict: disarmament, reparations, and a promise to stay within designated boundaries. The New Republic, flush with victory and led by Chancellor Mon Mothma, decided the best way to prevent another empire was to become the exact opposite of the Empire. This meant massive, sweeping demilitarization. They slashed the defense budget, decommissioned most of the fleet, and focused all their energy on healing the core worlds. The idea was that a show of peaceful intent would inspire peaceful intent in return. It was a beautiful, noble, and catastrophically naive idea. It was like beating a vicious guard dog in a fight, and then deciding to get rid of all your own fences because you assume the dog's puppies will be friendly. But not every Imperial got the memo to surrender. The real true believers, the fanatics who thought Palpatine was a god, and the Empire was divine order, saw the Concordance as treason. These weren't the petty warlords who set up shop in the Outer Rim with a single Star Destroyer and started calling themselves Moffs. These were the ideologues, the strategists, the officers who genuinely believed in the Imperial doctrine of absolute order through absolute force. Led by figures like the formidable Grand Admiral Ray Sloane, they saw the writing on the wall. Instead of surrendering, they executed a carefully planned strategic withdrawal. They gathered the Empire's best assets, its most advanced technological blueprints, its most loyal and ruthless officers, its wealthiest benefactors, and its most brilliant and morally bankrupt scientists. And they ran. Their destination? The unknown regions. The unknown regions are the galaxy's attic. It's a vast, uncharted, and terrifying expanse of space, where hyperspace lanes are unstable, navigation is a nightmare, and all sorts of weird and dangerous things are rumoured to live. It was the perfect place to hide, and we later learned they had a guide, a secret contingency plan from Emperor Palpatine himself, a mapped path through the chaos, his final gift to his most loyal followers. So, this caravan of Imperial fanatics vanished into the void, leaving the New Republic to think the job was done. Out there, in the icy silence between stars, they started over. They didn't call themselves the Imperial Remnant, they called themselves the First Order. And this is the key part. They were trying to build a better empire. They conducted a brutal after-action report on everything the old empire did wrong and set about fixing it. Mistake number 1. The old empire was bloated and corrupt. The First Order would be a lean, mean fighting machine. They prized efficiency over everything. There was no room for the nepotism and backstabbing that plagued Palpatine's court. Promotion was based on merit and fanatical loyalty, not on who your family was. Mistake number 2. The old empire relied on conscripts and recruits who might have doubts. This is where it gets seriously, darkly messed up. The First Order decided to create its personnel. They implemented a program of systematic, galaxy-wide child indoctrination. They weren't recruiting soldiers, they were manufacturing them. Kidnapping teams would raid remote, poorly defended worlds in the Outer Rim and literally steal children from their homes. These kids, toddlers often, were brought to training facilities on distant frozen worlds like the Steadfast or the Academy on Arcanis. Their training was psychological warfare. Their names were taken and replaced with alphanumeric designations. They were subjected to constant physical and mental abuse, designed to break their spirit and foster absolute loyalty to the collective. They were taught that the New Republic was a decadent, chaotic failure, and that the First Order was the only source of true strength and order. Mistake number 3. The old Empire's technology, while impressive, had flaws. The First Order's engineers got to work. They took Imperial designs and refined them. The old TIE fighter was a death trap with no shields. The First Order's TIE foe fighter was faster, more heavily armed, and actually had deflector shields and life support. The Imperial Star Destroyer was an iconic symbol of fear. The First Order's Resurgent-class Star Destroyer was longer, equipped with a vastly more powerful array of turbo lasers and ion cannons, and could carry a full complement of troops, fighters, and ground assault vehicles. Everything was bigger, badder, and shinier, but all of this raises a huge question. How do you pay for it? Building a secret, massive military empire in uncharted space isn't cheap. You need credits, raw materials, and shipyards. This is where the New Republic's political failure becomes absolutely breathtaking. Remember the Centrists? They were the political faction in the New Republic Senate that argued for a stronger central government, and though they rarely said it out loud, often admired the Empire's efficiency. Well, a significant number of them weren't just admirers, they were active collaborators. Through a complex web of shell corporations, blind trusts, and corrupt politicians, a vast amount of wealth was siphoned out of the core worlds and funneled straight into the unknown regions. Corporations that had profited from the Empire used their vast resources to fund the First Order's construction projects. The New Republic's own economy, in its blind pursuit of peace and profit, was literally funding the army that was being built to destroy it. It's the ultimate irony. The very freedom the New Republic offered allowed the seeds of its own destruction to be financed. The New Republic's official position was one of benign neglect. They didn't endorse the resistance, but they didn't shut them down either. A few sympathetic senators would secretly divert old equipment, decommissioned X-Wings, and funds their way. It was just enough to keep the lights on, but never enough to truly challenge the behemoth growing in the shadows. The resistance was a tripwire force, a handful of believers standing on the beach, hoping to hold back the tidal wave. And all the while, the First Order was building its masterpiece of overcompensation. Starkiller Base, the Empire, had the Death Star. The First Order looked at that and said, "That's cute, but it only kills one planet at a time." They found an ice planet, Ilum, a sacred Jedi world, the very place where lightsaber crystals were mined, adding a layer of profound insult to injury, and they hollowed it out. They turned an entire planet into a superweapon. It used dark energy to siphon the energy from a star, storing it in a horrific battery, and then firing a beam through hyperspace that could split into multiple strands and annihilate entire star systems light years away. It wasn't a tactical weapon, it was a strategic terror weapon designed to shatter the New Republic's will to fight in one single horrific demonstration. Now, every movement like this needs a symbol, it needs a face, and the face of the First Order was a young man wrapped in conflict, rage, and a famous last name. It was Kylo Ren, and his story is the most personal human tragedy in the entire sequel era. Imagine your parents are literal galactic legends. Your mother is Leia Organa, the rebel hero, the brilliant politician, the heart of the resistance. Your father is Han Solo, the smuggler-turned-war hero, the guy who flew the Kessel Run in record time, the man who shot first. Your uncle is Luke Skywalker, the last Jedi, the man who redeemed Darth Vader and destroyed the Emperor. Your family tree isn't a tree, it's a galactic monument. The expectations aren't high, they're astronomical. You're a symbol of the New Republic's hope, the living embodiment of the victory over the Empire. That's a lot for a kid, and by all accounts, Ben was a sensitive, emotionally powerful kid. He was strong with the Force, incredibly strong, a Skywalker after all. But that power came with a price. It made him feel everything more intensely. His fears, his anger, his feelings of not being good enough, of never measuring up to the legends his parents were. It was all amplified. He probably felt like he was living in a museum, dedicated to his family, and he was the one exhibit that didn't quite fit. This is where the vultures started to circle. We know that the dark side energy of Emperor Palpatine never truly died. His spirit, his essence, lingered in the unknown regions, festering, and he sensed this powerful, vulnerable, emotionally turbulent boy from light years away. For years, Palpatine's voice, disguised as the charismatic and manipulative voice of Snoke, whispered to Ben through the Force. It was a psychic grooming. Snoke preyed on all of Ben's insecurities. He told him what he desperately needed to hear, that his family didn't understand him, that they feared his power, that they had sent him away to be fixed. He validated Ben's anger and told him it was a source of strength, not a flaw. He isolated him in his own mind, long before he was ever physically isolated. So Leia and Han, seeing their son struggling, made what they thought was the best choice. They sent him to his uncle, Luke. They thought the structure of the Jedi, the wisdom of Luke, could help him. It was a Hail Mary pass from parents who were in way over their heads, and that's where it all went catastrophically wrong. Luke Skywalker, the legend, was a terrible teacher. He was trying to rebuild the Jedi Order based on ancient flawed texts, and he was terrified of failure. He saw the same darkness in Ben that he'd felt in his father. This was a gift the First Order couldn't have even dreamed of. The grandson of Darth Vader, the son of their greatest enemies. He was the ultimate propaganda tool. They gave him a new name, a new identity, Kylo Ren. The name was itself a pathetic act of worship. Kylo was a twist on his own name, and Ren was from the Knights of Ren, a group of dark side fanatics he would eventually lead. He was trying so hard to be something he wasn't. He wasn't a cool, collected Sith Lord like Vader. He was a rage-filled, emotionally shattered young man cosplaying as one, and the First Order loved it. They gave him a fancy title, Supreme Leader Snoke's Enforcer, and let him loose. Alright, let's set the hyperdrive way back. We're not talking decades or even centuries ago. We're talking thousands of years before Luke, Leia, or even the Old Republic we know from the prequels. This is the era of big beards, even bigger prophecies, and space wizards who hadn't quite figured out that maybe building your superweapon to look like a skull is a little bit on the nose. This is the Great Hyperspace War, and it's the first time the galaxy at large learned a very important, very terrifying lesson. There are things in the dark between the stars, and sometimes they know how to knock. First, you got to understand the lay of the land. The Galactic Republic is young, still trying to figure out how to get the Wi-Fi to work in all the Senate buildings. It's a hopeful, optimistic time. The Jedi Order exists, but they're not the galaxy's police yet. They're more like philosopher monks. Their biggest concerns are meditating on the Force, and occasionally mediating a dispute between two planets arguing over mining rights to an asteroid. They're comfortable. They're complacent. They're about to have their entire worldview turned inside out. Now, let's talk about the bad guys, because their origin story is wild. It doesn't start with the Sith Empire. It starts with a bunch of Jedi who got a little too curious. You know how every library has a restricted section with all the creepy books? Well, these Jedi didn't just read the creepy books. They started trying out the spells in the back. They dove headfirst into the dark side, got a taste for power, and got rightfully booted out of the Jedi Order. So now you have a bunch of incredibly powerful, deeply bitter ex-Jedi with serious anger issues and a massive grudge. They're exiled, sent packing into the great unknown of the galaxy. These exiles, after who knows how long of drifting through space, finally stumble upon a planet called Korriban. And on Korriban, they find the Sith species. Now, these native Sith aren't Sith Lords yet. They're a red-skinned, fiercely strong species with a natural, primal connection to the dark side. They're incredibly powerful, but they're also primitive. They've built a massive, brutal empire on their own world, centered around strength, power, and some truly intimidating architecture. Think giant pyramids and temples that look like they're made of blood and shadows. They're a big deal on their own block, but they're not a galactic threat. Then the Dark Jedi show up. Imagine you're a primitive culture, even a powerful one, and a group of people show up who can move things with their minds, see the future, and shoot lightning from their fingertips. You're not going to fight them, you're going to assume they're gods, which is exactly what happened. The Dark Jedi saw an entire species of powerful, impressionable followers. The Sith saw deities come to life. It was a match made in, well, the dark side. The two groups merged. The Dark Jedi intermarried with the Sith overlords, and over centuries their cultures fused into something new and terrifying, the Sith Empire. The raw, primal dark side power of the Sith species was combined with the knowledge, discipline, and sheer ambition of the fallen Jedi. They built a massive empire in the unknown regions, completely isolated, festering in their own power, worshipping strength above all else. And the craziest part? The Republic and the Jedi had no idea they even existed. They were a ghost story that hadn't been written yet. The secret held until a pair of siblings, Gav and Jory Darrigan, decided to try out a new experimental hyperdrive on their ship, the Starbreaker 12. They were basically the ancient equivalent of test pilots with a death wish. They punched it, got hopelessly lost, and accidentally jumped right into the heart of Sith space. The Sith, led by the mighty Dark Lord Marka Ragnos, were fascinated. When Ragnos died, a new ambitious Dark Lord named Naga Sadow saw the Darrigans for what they were, a living roadmap back to the Republic. He saw a galaxy that was soft, unprepared, and ripe for conquest. He manipulated the siblings, and the stage was set for a nightmare. Now, let's talk about the invasion itself, because this is where it stops being history and starts being a horror movie. This wasn't a war like we think of wars. There were no polite declarations, no clear battle lines. For the average citizen on a Republic world, it started with nothing. A weird silence on the subspace comms, a few missing trade ships. Then the sky would change. Naga Sadow was a master of Sith magic, specifically illusions. His fleet wasn't massive, but he didn't need it to be. He could project the image of thousands of warships, where there were only dozens. Imagine you're a farmer on a quiet agricultural world. You look up, and the sun is blotted out by a fleet of monstrous, jagged ships that look like they were carved from nightmares. The scale is incomprehensible. The fear is instant and paralyzing. You don't fight, you can't fight, you just fall to your knees in terror. Many worlds surrendered without a single shot being fired. The psychological warfare was everything. But for the worlds that didn't surrender, or where the Republic actually had a garrison, the reality was even worse. The Sith didn't just have soldiers, they had monsters. They unleashed genetically engineered war beasts, like the Terentatex, creatures designed to hunt and kill Force sensitives, and the Leviathans, massive creatures that could level cities. Their soldiers, the Massassi warriors, were hulking, genetically altered Sith mutants, bred for nothing but violence and obedience. They weren't soldiers, they were a force of nature. If you lived on a core world, you might have a little more time, but the fear was a slow-growing poison. You'd see refugees pouring in from the outer rim, their ships battered, their eyes hollow with stories you can barely believe. The government is in chaos. The Senate is screaming matches and paralysis. The Jedi are scrambling, trying to be everywhere at once and failing. There's a sense of utter helplessness. The institutions you trusted to protect you are crumbling. The tide only turned because of a few key factors. First, the Jedi, after getting their backsides handed to them, adapted. They stopped trying to fight a conventional war and started using the Force to fight the Sith's tricks. They learned to see through Sadow's illusions, to target the real ships hidden within the Phantom fleets. They became battlefield commanders out of sheer necessity. Second, and this is the best part, the Sith did what Sith do best. They started backstabbing each other. A rival Sith Lord, Ludo Kresh, thought Naga Sadow's invasion was a stupid, reckless idea. As the Republic began to rally, Kresh saw his chance, declared Sadow a traitor, and started a civil war within the Sith Empire, right in the middle of their invasion. It's the ultimate villain trope, and it saved the Republic's skin. The final battle was at Coruscant itself. Sadow's real fleet was in orbit, bombarding the planet. He was so confident, he was directing the whole thing from a secret meditation sphere hidden near a star, using its energy to power his illusions. The Darrigan siblings, realizing the horror they'd unleashed, led a desperate Republic strike force right to his doorstep. They attacked his sphere, breaking his concentration. Over Coruscant, the terrifying illusion of an infinite armada flickered and died, revealing the truth: a much smaller, vulnerable fleet. The Republic defenders, their courage renewed, swarmed and destroyed them. Defeated, Sado fled back to the Sith Empire, only to find it in ruins from his civil war. He took his loyalists and ran, eventually ending up on Yavin 4 to sulk for a few centuries. The Republic won, but the victory was Pyrrhic. Worlds were scoured, millions were dead. The galactic economy was in shambles. The psychological scar was deep and permanent. The Jedi Order was forever changed. They were no longer just philosophers, they were soldiers and guardians, hardened by a war against a darkness they now knew was always lurking. The Great Hyperspace War was the galaxy's original trauma. It was the moment their innocence died, the moment they learned that the unknown wasn't just empty space, it was hiding monsters. And it was a warning, the first and most stark, that peace is not a default state. It's something you have to fight for, because the dark side never really sleeps, it just waits. Let's set the hyperdrive for a seriously old-school era. We're talking about the Mandalorian Wars. Now, if you think the Clone Wars were a messy political quagmire, or the Galactic Civil War had clear-cut good guys and bad guys, prepare to have your entire perspective shifted. This conflict is the ultimate grey area. It's a tragedy where everyone had a point, everyone made terrible mistakes, and the fallout literally reshaped the fate of the galaxy for centuries. This is the war that asked the hardest question. Is it better to stand by your principles and watch innocents die, or betray everything you believe in to save them? The Galactic Republic is chugging along, but it's comfortable. It's been at peace for a while. Its military isn't exactly top tier. It's more of a peacekeeping force, designed to handle pirates and the occasional trade dispute, not a full-scale invasion. And the Jedi Order? The Jedi of this era are the ultimate ivory tower academics. They're philosophers, scholars, and diplomats. They spend their days meditating on the deeper mysteries of the Force and debating the ethical implications of using a paperclip without permission. They're deeply cautious, deeply traditional, and they believe their role is to be guardians of peace and life, not soldiers. They're the kind of people who would see a house on fire and form a committee to discuss the philosophical implications of water, before even thinking about grabbing a hose. Now, enter the Mandalorians. And we're not talking about the noble, creed-honouring, found family Mandalorians we know and love from the Mandalorian show. This is the Mandalorian Neo-Crusader movement, led by the formidable, charismatic, and utterly ruthless Mandalore the Ultimate. These guys aren't interested in conquest for resources or political power. They're interested in war as a cultural imperative. Their entire society is built on the concept of proving your strength and honour through battle. And they've decided the entire galaxy is their sparring partner. They start surging out of the Outer Rim, and they are not messing around. They break worlds. They employ brutal, total war tactics. Planetary bombardments, orbital strikes on civilian centres, enslavement of populations. They are a force of nature, a tsunami of durasteel, and pure, unadulterated aggression. Imagine you're a shopkeeper on a mid-rim world like Taris, a bustling, civilized planet. Your life is your business, your family, your neighborhood. The war starts as a distant news story. Reports on the HoloNet about some barbarians causing trouble in the Outer Rim. You might feel a twinge of concern. Maybe prices for imported goods get a little weird, but it doesn't really touch you. Then, one by one, the news reports from those outer systems start to go silent, static. The official Republic announcements become more frantic, less assured. If you lived in the Outer Rim, you weren't hearing about the war. You were in it. Your planet was the news story that went silent. The Mandalorians didn't declare war. They arrived. Their fleets would darken the sky, and their first move was often to shatter planetary communications. You were isolated instantly. The choice was stark and immediate: surrender or be annihilated. Surrender didn't mean peace, it meant subjugation. The Mandalorians would often install a puppet government, conscript the population into labor camps to support their war machine, and strip your world of every usable resource. Resistance was met with overwhelming, brutal force. Life became a matter of keeping your head down, trying to scrape together enough food, and hoping the Mandalorian overseer wasn't having a bad day. For Republic citizens, the debate over the Jedi was a constant, bitter source of tension. The Republic's frontier defenses shatter like glass, their fleets are outdated, their tactics are obsolete, and they are losing systems at an alarming rate. The death toll is catastrophic. Entire planets are left as smouldering ruins. So, the Republic government, in a total panic, does the obvious thing. They turn to the Jedi Order, the galaxy's supposed protectors, and the Jedi High Council on Coruscant says no. Yeah, let that sink in. The Jedi refuse to help. Their reasoning, from a certain point of view, is actually pretty sound. They sense a profound darkness behind the Mandalorian invasion. They believe the Mandalorians are merely a tool, the sharp, pointy end of a spear, being wielded by a far greater, unseen Sith threat lurking in the shadows. Their fear is that by leaping into a full-scale war, the Jedi will be corrupted by the violence, will fall to the dark side, and will play right into the hands of this hidden enemy. They believe the true battle is a spiritual one, and that engaging in a physical war is a dangerous distraction. They counsel caution, patience, and defense. They tell the Republic to hold the line and trust in the Force. Now, put yourself in the boots of a young Jedi Knight or Padawan. You've spent your entire life training. You've mastered the Force. You can feel the fear and agony of billions of beings crying out as the Mandalorian war machine grinds them to dust. You have the power to make a difference, to save lives. And your bosses, safe and sound in their pristine temple, wrapped in their comfortable traditions, tell you to stand down and meditate while the galaxy burns. The moral conflict would tear you apart. This is where our hero, and eventually our villain, enters the stage. Meet Revan, and meet his best friend, Malak. At this point, they are not Sith Lords. They are two of the most brilliant, powerful, and charismatic Jedi the Order has produced in generations. Revan isn't only a warrior, he's a strategic prodigy, a natural leader, a philosopher who sees the bigger picture. He looks at the Council's inaction and doesn't see wisdom. He sees a failure of courage and a betrayal of the Jedi's most basic duty, to protect the innocent. So, he makes a choice that will echo through history. He openly defies the Jedi Council. He stands before the Jedi Order and the Republic Senate and delivers a speech that boils down to, "Our duty is to life, not to dogma. If we will not stand against this evil, then we are not Jedi." His words are electric. They ignite a fire in the hearts of Jedi who are sick of watching and waiting. Hundreds of Jedi, along with the vast majority of the Republic military, rally to his banner. This is the Great Schism. This isn't a fall to the dark side. Not yet. It's a rebellion of conscience. These Jedi, who become known as the Revanchists, believe with every fibre of their being that they are doing the right thing, the truly Jedi thing. Revan is a military genius. He realizes you can't beat the Mandalorians with Republic tactics. So, he starts learning from the enemy. He studies their strategies, their culture, their relentless, aggressive style of warfare. He adopts their tactics and improves upon them. He becomes a master of unpredictable, devastating maneuvers. He and Malak lead from the front, their lightsabers blazing alongside their soldiers. The holonet and public discourse were split. One side, the Hawks, saw the Jedi Council as cowardly fools, hiding in their temple while citizens died. They lionized Revan and his followers as the only ones with the courage to do what was necessary. The other side, the Doves, feared the Jedi becoming soldiers, warning that it would destroy their soul and lead to something worse. And then there was the economic reality. War is astronomically expensive. The Republic began a massive military build-up to support Revan's campaigns. This meant skyrocketing taxes. It meant rationing of fuel, food, and consumer goods. That brand new speeder you were saving for, forget it. The factory that made them is now making blaster rifles. That exotic fruit you liked from the Outer Rim, the supply lines are cut. It's not available anymore. If you weren't directly involved in the war effort, working in a shipyard, a munitions factory, or joining the army, your economic prospects dwindled. Inflation ran rampant. The wealth gap became a chasm, with war profiteers getting rich, while ordinary families struggled. For the soldiers in the Republic Army, life was a special kind of hell. Farmers, mechanics, students, they were given basic training and thrown into a meat grinder against the most formidable warriors in the galaxy. Their morale was initially terrible. They were losing, constantly. Then Revan showed up. He offered them something they desperately needed: hope. His presence could turn a routed unit into a determined fighting force, but his strategies were also brutally efficient. For every soldier who worshipped him, another was terrified by his cold, calculating demeanor. His name becomes a symbol of hope. He pushes the Mandalorians back, winning victory after bloody victory. But this is the central, heartbreaking tragedy of the Mandalorian Wars. The path Revan walks is paved with moral compromises. You cannot immerse yourself in that level of violence and hatred without it changing you. To outthink and outfight the Mandalorians, Revan has to make brutal, calculating decisions. He sacrifices platoons to win battles. He sacrifices battles to win campaigns. He begins to see the soldiers under his command, and even the Jedi who follow him, as pieces on a Dejeric board, assets to be spent for the greater good of victory. The war forges him into a brilliant commander, but tempers him into something colder, harder, and sharper. The light side idealist is slowly being replaced by a pragmatic, ends justify the means strategist. The dark side isn't a sudden fall, it's a slow creeping frost that covers his soul. This all culminates in the final, apocalyptic battle of Malak 5. Revan engineers a masterful trap for the entirety of the Mandalorian fleet, but his ultimate weapon isn't a fleet of ships. It's a super weapon of terrifying scale, the mass shadow generator. This device creates an artificial gravity well so intense it crushes everything in the vicinity: ships, fighters, people, even the planet's surface itself. It's a weapon of mass destruction on a scale the galaxy hadn't seen before. It works. The Mandalorian fleet is completely and utterly annihilated. In the midst of the chaos, Revan confronts Mandalore, the ultimate, in single combat, defeats him, and takes the leader's mask as a trophy. The Mandalorian Wars are over. The Republic has won. The cost was soul-shattering. The battlefield at Malak 5 is transformed into a permanent graveyard, a tomb for millions of Mandalorians and Republic soldiers alike. The event is so horrific, so saturated in death and pain, that it creates a wound in the Force itself, a scar that will traumatize sensitive beings for millennia. The Jedi who followed Revan are not heroes returning in triumph. They are broken, haunted veterans. They have used their power for destruction. They have embraced the passion and anger of battle to fuel their abilities. They have stared into the abyss for so long that the abyss has stared back, and it has taken up residence inside them. And Revan, the great hero, he stood at the epicenter of that atrocity. He felt the death of millions, the screams of his own soldiers alongside his enemies, rip through the Force, the weight of every life lost, every brutal decision he made, and the immense dark side energy he had been flirting with finally crashed down on him. The hero was gone. In his place was something new, something empty and hungry for power. The man who went to war to save the Republic had become the galaxy's greatest threat. He and Malak took the remnants of their loyal fleet and their most battle-hardened, corrupted Jedi followers, and they vanished into the unknown regions. The Republic waited for their saviors to return home to a hero's welcome. Instead, they returned as conquerors. They came back as Darth Revan and Darth Malak, Dark Lords of a new, more powerful Sith Empire, armed with intimate knowledge of Republic strategy and weaknesses, ready to subjugate the very galaxy they had just saved. We're travelling back over 3,000 years before the rise of the Empire. This is the saga of the Great Galactic War, a nearly 3-decade-long struggle that serves as the foundational trauma for the Old Republic era. To call it a war is to undersell it. It was a calculated campaign of galactic-scale terror, a meticulously orchestrated symphony of destruction conducted by a single, immortal Sith Emperor whose ambitions reached far beyond mere conquest. Forget Palpatine for a second and meet Emperor or Darth Vitiate, also known as the Sith Emperor, Valkorion, and about a dozen other names because the guy had a serious identity crisis. He was ancient, a Sith Lord who had lived for centuries through dark side rituals that consumed entire worlds and sacrificed millions of lives. He sought to devour all life in the galaxy, to absorb its energy into himself and achieve a form of dark side apotheosis, becoming a literal god of nothingness. This crucial context changes everything. For Vitiate, the Sith Empire was not a nation to be nurtured. It was a weapon to be sharpened, a tool of unimaginable scale designed for a single, horrific purpose: to bleed the galaxy dry for his own sustenance. Every battle, every death served his ultimate nihilistic goal. Arrayed against this existential threat was the Galactic Republic. By this point in history, the Republic was the established galactic power, but it had grown complacent. Its institutions were bureaucratic and slow-moving. Its military, while present, was a peacetime force designed for policing actions and border disputes, not a total war against a peer adversary. The Jedi Order was strong and respected. They were utterly unprepared for the sheer, hate-fueled fervor of the enemy they were about to face. The Republic's leadership lacked a single, defining figurehead at the war's start. It was a government of committees, prone to debate and delay when decisive action was needed. Their champions would have to emerge from the crucible of the conflict itself. The war began not with a formal declaration, but with a scream of terror echoed across 1,000 worlds. Vitiate's Sith Empire launched a simultaneous, devastating blitzkrieg on a scale the galaxy had never witnessed. This was a coordinated attack designed to decapitate the Republic's leadership and shatter its morale in one fell swoop. Key systems were hit at once. Republic defense fleets, caught completely by surprise, were annihilated in their docks. Orbital platforms fell. Planetary shields failed before they could be fully activated. For the average citizen on a core or mid-rim world, the outbreak of the war was a terrifying, incomprehensible shock. The profound sense of security that the Republic had provided for centuries evaporated overnight. This wasn't a conflict happening in some distant, nebulous outer rim. The fear was immediate and visceral. Planets like Ord-Radama, Sluisvan, and Balmorra became household names overnight, not for their industry or culture, but as the sites of brutal, devastating battles and grinding occupations. The price of goods skyrocketed as supply lines were severed. A deep, gnawing anxiety became the new normal. For the first several years, the Republic was on its back foot, losing ground catastrophically. The Sith possessed the strategic initiative, terrifying new war machines, and the raw, destructive power of the dark side. A single Sith Lord could alter the course of a battle. Imagine the terror of a Republic soldier. You're holding the line with your blaster rifle against waves of relentless Sith troopers, and then a figure in dark robes walks calmly through the crossfire, deflecting bolts with a red lightsaber and unleashing storms of lightning that incinerate your entire squad. The psychological warfare was as potent as the physical attack. The Republic military and their Jedi allies were forced into a desperate, grinding war of attrition. They were constantly reacting, constantly retreating, often forced to make the horrific choice of sacrificing one world to save 3 others. This brutal reality forced the Jedi Order into an existential crisis. They could no longer afford to be merely peacekeepers. They had to become generals, admirals, and soldiers. Jedi Masters found themselves commanding fleets from the bridges of warships. Knights and Padawans were thrust into frontline combat roles long before their training was complete. The war forced upon them a series of impossible, soul-crushing choices. Do you use a force power that borders on the dark side to break an enemy formation and save your troops? Do you order a retreat, condemning a city to occupation to preserve your forces for a more defensible position? The line between Jedi Guardian and military asset blurred into obscurity. The psychological toll was immense. They were fighting an enemy that actively fed on their fear, anger, and pain. Figures like the noble Jedi Master Ven Zalo became symbols of this new reality. A diplomat forced to become a warrior. The Sith Empire, for all its might, was often its own worst enemy, a classic and enduring weakness of the Sith. Their culture, built on the rule of the strong, encouraged constant, internal rivalry, betrayal, and power grabs. While this produced incredibly powerful and ruthless individuals, it also meant their war effort was often fractured. Sith Lords would hoard resources, sabotage each other's campaigns for personal glory, and even assassinate rivals, all while the war was being fought. This is perfectly exemplified in Darth Malgus. He was, in many ways, the Empire's perfect military instrument, a visionary, brutally efficient warrior who believed in strength and merit above all else. He was a key architect of numerous victories, including the infamous sacking of Coruscant. Yet Malgus also held a deep contempt for the political infighting and corruption festering within the Empire's leadership. He saw their scheming as a weakness that undermined military efficiency. His story is one of conflicting loyalties to the Empire's stated purpose of conquest, but also to his own pure, unadulterated belief in strength, which often put him at odds with the very Empire he served. The war dragged on for 28 years, a seemingly endless exchange of planets, moons and star systems, each one paid for in rivers of blood. But the conflict is ultimately defined by two events that were less military engagements and more exercises in psychological annihilation, masterminded by Vitiate to break the Republic's spirit completely. The first is the sacking of Coruscant. This remains one of the most audacious and devastating acts of warfare in galactic history. In a stroke of strategic genius, the Sith Empire feigned a desire for peace negotiations. They lured the bulk of the Republic fleet, including its most senior Jedi and military commanders, to a remote world for talks. With Coruscant's defences critically weakened, the main Sith armada, led by figures like Darth Angral, Darth Malgus, launched a surprise attack on the galactic capital itself. The planet fell with shocking speed. Sith forces marched on the Jedi Temple, a symbol of hope and light for millennia. They desecrated its halls, burning archives and slaughtering Jedi where they stood. Master Venzalo made a heroic final stand and was cut down by Darth Malgus. The Sith occupied the Senate district, took the Supreme Chancellor hostage, and held the entire planet under their thumb. It was a symbolic castration. The heart of the Republic was torn out and displayed as a trophy on live HoloNet feeds across the galaxy. Vitiate's message was chillingly clear. Your institutions cannot protect you. Your hope is an illusion. Nowhere is safe. Beaten, broken, and with its capital held hostage, the Republic had no choice. They were forced to sign the Treaty of Coruscant under the most extreme duress. The Republic was forced to cede massive amounts of territory to the Sith Empire, drastically disarm its military, and, in its most cruel clause, officially abandon countless worlds and billions of its own citizens to Sith rule. It was a betrayal of everything the Republic claimed to stand for. Signed at lightsaber point, the aftermath of the war was a galaxy shrouded in a cold, bitter silence, known as the Cold War era. The Jedi Order, blamed by many for the failure to protect Coruscant, retreated into a state of grief and shame, exiling themselves to the ancient world of Tython to lick their wounds and re-evaluate their place in the galaxy. The Republic was left fractured and drowning in a potent mixture of humiliation, grief, and a burning, smouldering desire for revenge. And on the hundreds of abandoned worlds, life under the Sith Empire was a nightmare of oppression, slavery, and fear, as petty Sith lords and Moffs fought over their new territories, ruling with absolute and cruel authority. The Great Galactic War was over, but it was merely the opening move in Vitiate's long game. The peace was a lie, a temporary ceasefire that everyone knew was just the prelude to the next, even darker chapter. The scars it left on worlds, on institutions, and on the collective psyche of the galaxy would never truly fade. Alright, let's talk about the biggest glow-up in galactic history. To really get why Darth Bane is such a big deal, you have to understand what a complete mess the Sith were before he showed up. A bunch of people with red lightsabers and serious anger issues, all living in one house, constantly backstabbing each other for a slightly bigger room. That was basically the Sith Order for the longest time. They had numbers, sure, dozens, maybe hundreds of Force sensitives, all calling themselves Sith Lords, all vying for power, and it made them incredibly, stupidly weak. Their entire history was a cycle. They'd get a little power, then they'd immediately start infighting until they collapsed from within, and the Jedi would swoop in and mop up the survivors. They were their own worst enemy, and they were too arrogant to even see it. This is the world that a man named Dessel was born into. He was a miner on a horrible backwater planet called Apatros, spending his days in the deep, dark caves, hacking cortosis ore out of the rock for barely enough credits to survive. His life was defined by two things: brutal physical labor and the constant seething anger that came from being treated as utterly disposable by the galaxy. He escaped by joining the military during one of the Sith's many petty wars, and his natural talent for violence and strategy, honed from a life of having to fight for everything, quickly got him noticed. He was strong in the Force, and the Sith, always desperate for cannon fodder, pulled him into their ranks. But as he rose, he saw the rot. He saw Sith Lords sacrificing entire armies of their own followers just to gain a slight edge over a rival. He saw them plotting and scheming against each other instead of focusing on their true enemy, the Jedi. He saw the sheer, staggering waste of it all. The Sith were like a pack of rabid dogs tearing each other apart over a scrap of meat, while the Jedi, organised and united, were the farmers calmly waiting to put down the whole pack. Bane, the name he would later take, realised something fundamental. The Sith, as they were structured, were doomed. They were destined to fail forever because their greatest weakness wasn't the Jedi Order. It was their own pathetic self-destructive nature. All that history, all that power, was being pissed away by a bunch of squabbling children. His moment of clarity came from an unexpected place, the Jedi. He was a reader, which already made him weird among the Sith, who were mostly doers. He dug into the archives, studying the Jedi and their history. He learned about a Jedi Master named Hoth, who led an army of light against the Sith. And it hit him. The Jedi won because they had structure, they had unity, they had a chain of command and a shared purpose. The Sith had chaos. They had every man and woman for themselves. Bane understood that the Sith's obsession with strength through conflict was correct, but they were applying it all wrong. Having 100 Sith Lords didn't make you strong. It made you weak. It diluted the dark side's power, spreading it thin among a bunch of unworthy idiots who would inevitably try to kill each other. It created endless points of failure. The Sith needed to stop thinking like a government or an army and start thinking like a virus. This led him to create a new doctrine, a radical, brutal, and utterly brilliant new law for the Sith. He called it the Rule of Two. The philosophy was deceptively simple, just a single line. Two there should be, no more, no less. One to embody power, the other to crave it. It was a complete reinvention of what it meant to be Sith. Think about the sheer genius of it. First, it solved the infighting problem overnight. With only two Sith, the constant backstabbing and political maneuvering was over. There was no one else to conspire with. The Master's job was to gather and hoard all the knowledge and power of the dark side, to become the most powerful Sith alive. The apprentice's job was to learn everything they could, to become strong enough to one day challenge and kill the Master, taking their place and claiming that power for themselves. It was a perfect, self-perpetuating cycle. Only the strongest, smartest, and most cunning would survive and carry the Sith legacy forward. It was Darwinian evolution applied to the dark side. Each new master would be stronger than the last, because they had to be to survive. Darth Bane's era, for all its strategic brilliance for the Sith, was an absolutely terrifying and miserable time to be an ordinary person in the galaxy. This period, often called the Republic Dark Age, or the post-Yuuzhan era, was because of a creeping, silent sickness that infected every level of society. The Jedi Civil War and the Battle of Yuuzhan. This was the final, spastic death rattle of the old Sith Empire, and it was brutal. Then Bane detonates his thought bomb on Yuuzhan. The psychic shockwave of that event was horrific. It was a weapon that damned them. Force-sensitive beings across the galaxy likely felt a moment of sheer, existential terror, a scream in the Force, as countless souls were torn apart and trapped in an eternity of agony. For a brief moment, the entire galaxy felt a chill they couldn't explain. It was an omen, a wrongness that settled into the bones of the universe. Now the Sith are gone, the Jedi win. And this is where the real, long-term problem for the average person begins. Because the Jedi's victory created a false sense of security that made the galaxy incredibly vulnerable. The Republic, believing the Sith extinct, did what all governments do after a long war. They demilitarized. They drastically scaled back their fleet and army, believing they would never face a large-scale threat again. This had a direct, tangible impact on everyday safety. Without a strong centralized military, the Outer Rim became a lawless nightmare. With no Republic patrols to fear, criminal syndicates like the Hutts grew massively in power. Piracy became a regular hazard for shipping lanes. If you were a colonist on a remote world, your settlement could be raided by slavers, and there was no one to call for help. The Republic wasn't coming. You were on your own. If your planet was threatened by a natural disaster, a plague, or a local warlord, The Republic's ability to project power and provide aid was crippled. The institutional knowledge and resources for large-scale humanitarian or military interventions withered away from disuse. You couldn't rely on a centralized government for protection. Your planet's security was your own problem, and if you weren't strong enough, you were conquered or exploited. This leads to the second big problem: corruption and stagnation. With no massive external threat to unite against, the Galactic Republic turned inward. The Senate on Coruscant became a bloated, inefficient bureaucracy where nothing got done. Corruption festered. So why was it bad to live in the era of the Rule of Two's beginning? You were living in a galaxy that thought it was safe, but was actually a patient slowly being poisoned. The Jedi Civil War was one of the darkest and most complicated conflicts in galactic history. A war that shattered the Jedi Order, left countless worlds scarred, and set the stage for centuries of mistrust between Force users and the wider galaxy. This was Jedi against Jedi, student against teacher, with entire fleets commanded by those who once embodied the light. And it all spiraled into devastation under the iron grip of two former heroes, Revan and Malak. By the time the Mandalorian Wars had ended, the galaxy should have been in a period of relief. The Mandalorians were defeated, their war machines dismantled, their crusade halted. But victory came with a hidden cost. Many Jedi who followed Revan into that war returned changed, carrying scars both physical and spiritual. They had seen battle on a scale the Order had never prepared them for, and they had been led by Revan, brilliant, charismatic, ruthless, and already straying toward a dangerous path. When Revan and Malak returned, it wasn't as war-weary veterans seeking peace, but as conquerors who believed they knew a better way to rule the galaxy. The war officially began when the Jedi Council finally realized that Revan and Malak had gone too far. They were no longer bound by the Jedi Code, no longer even pretending to serve the Republic. They declared themselves Sith Lords, seized the remnants of the Mandalorian war machine, and carved together a massive empire almost overnight. The shock of it was immeasurable. Ordinary citizens, who once saw Revan as the savior of the Republic, now found their fleets bombarding their cities. Jedi who had once called him a brother now had to face him as a sworn enemy. It was betrayal on a scale that shook the galaxy's faith. What made Revan and Malak so dangerous wasn't only that they were powerful duelists or masters of the Force, though they were both nearly unmatched in combat. It was that they were brilliant strategists. Revan had always been a thinker, someone who could see 3 moves ahead in war. With the stolen Starforge at his disposal, an ancient Rakatan space station capable of producing infinite warships and weapons, he had the resources to sustain a war machine like nothing the galaxy had seen before. Entire fleets seemed to appear from nowhere, fully armed and staffed, giving the Sith Empire a seemingly endless supply of strength. Malak, more brutal and direct, carried out the campaigns with terrifying efficiency, burning planets into submission when diplomacy or cunning failed. Together, they were a perfect storm. Revan the mind, Malak the hammer. The Jedi were caught unprepared. The Order had already been weakened by the Mandalorian conflict, with many of their knights lost, disillusioned, or still scattered across distant sectors. Worse, the Republic Senate was hesitant and indecisive, afraid of repeating the mistakes of the Mandalorian Wars, when their delays had nearly cost them everything. That hesitation played right into Revan's hands. World after world fell to his fleets before the Republic could even organize a defense. And the terrifying part was that not all of these worlds resisted. Many saw in Revan a strong leader who could bring stability where the Republic offered only bureaucracy and corruption. For those worlds, pledging loyalty to the Sith Empire seemed like the safer choice. Inside the Jedi Order, the war was tearing them apart. Some believed that fighting Revan meant fighting their own brothers and sisters, those they had once trained alongside. Others saw no choice but to confront him, knowing that to delay was to risk the total collapse of the Republic. Imagine standing on a battlefield, staring across at someone you once trusted with your life, and realizing that now you had to cut them down. It wasn't a clean war of good versus evil. It was a war of broken bonds, of choices twisted by circumstance, of ideals corrupted by ambition. While Revan still carried some sense of vision, a belief that the galaxy needed strong leadership, even if it meant tyranny, Malak increasingly leaned into brutality. Civilian populations were enslaved or exterminated. In Malak's eyes, mercy was weakness, and conquest required fear. One of the darkest moments came with the attack on Taris, where Malak ordered the bombardment of the entire planet simply to prevent a handful of Jedi from escaping. Millions died in a single command, and for many in the galaxy, it confirmed their worst fears about the Sith, that there was no reasoning with them, no compromise, only domination through destruction. The Republic, battered and desperate, began to adapt. Jedi still loyal to the Council, regrouped and found ways to resist, sometimes in small skirmishes, sometimes in larger campaigns. The Battle of Duro, the defense of Corellia, and countless other engagements showed that Revan's empire, for all its power, was not invincible. And beneath it all, something was happening that would change the course of everything. Revan himself was beginning to waver. Despite his mastery of the dark side, there remained a spark of something else in him, a hesitation that Malak did not share. That hesitation eventually became the opening that shifted the entire war. If you lived in the Outer Rim, life became chaos. Sith fleets would appear overnight. Trade routes collapsed, meaning food shortages were everywhere. A planet like Telos was devastated in a single strike. Farmers couldn't farm, merchants couldn't trade, families didn't even know if their sons and daughters, who had joined the Republic Navy, were fighting for the Republic anymore, or had already switched sides to Revan's Sith. On Republic worlds, rationing became a way of life. You couldn't count on power, food, or even safety. Smugglers thrived, but they charged everything at impossible prices. It was common for families to sell heirlooms, or even indenture themselves, just to survive. Refugees flooded safer systems, creating tension. Local governments didn't want to take them in, but closing the gates meant watching starving crowds outside spaceports. Under Sith-controlled planets, the situation was worse. Malak's war doctrine was brutal. Even in neutral systems, there was no peace. Pirates and mercenaries exploited the chaos. Hyperlanes became hunting grounds. If you wanted to travel between planets, you had to accept the risk that your transport might be hijacked, your cargo stolen, and your passengers sold to slavers. For ordinary beings, the galaxy felt like it was shrinking. Places that had once been safe to visit suddenly became war zones. And think of the psychological toll. Whole generations grew up knowing nothing but war. The Republic military, meanwhile, lived through despair. Veterans who fought with Revan in the Mandalorian Wars now found themselves fighting against him. Revan's downfall became through betrayal, from the very apprentice who had once stood at his side. Malak, impatient with his master's restraint and hungry for full control, turned on Revan in the heat of battle. During an engagement with Jedi forces, Malak fired on Revan's flagship, leaving his master gravely wounded. To the galaxy, it looked like the Republic had finally struck a decisive blow. To Malak, it was his chance to claim the title of Dark Lord without challenge. But what neither of them expected was that the Jedi would recover Revan's broken body, heal him, and ultimately reshape his destiny. This twist, the capture and mind-wiping, changed the course of the war. Stripped of his memories, Revan was remade into a Republic soldier, unaware of his past as a Sith Lord. And yet, even without those memories, his brilliance and strength began to surface again. Slowly, he pieced together the truth, guided by the Jedi Bastila Shan and others who had been assigned to monitor him. What followed was one of the most extraordinary redemptions in galactic history. The former Dark Lord of the Sith becoming the Republic's greatest weapon against his own empire. Meanwhile, Malak pressed on with his campaign, more unrestrained than ever. He leaned fully into the Starforge's power, using it to spawn ships and droids at an unsustainable pace. But in his arrogance, he didn't see the cracks forming. The Republic, bolstered by Revan's unexpected return to the light, began striking critical blows against the Sith fleet. World by world, system by system, the balance of power began to shift back. And with every victory, Malak's desperation grew. He became more cruel, more erratic, more willing to sacrifice anything to hold on to his throne. The climax came in the assault on the Starforge itself. The Republic launched a daring campaign to destroy the source of the Sith's endless war machine, while Revan confronted his former apprentice in a final, brutal duel. It was a confrontation of everything the Jedi Civil War represented: vision against brutality, loyalty against betrayal, the remnants of the old Revan, against the path Malak had chosen. In the end, Malak fell. Where Malak saw only domination, Revan, even scarred by the dark side, rediscovered something closer to compassion. When the Starforge was finally destroyed, the war ended almost instantly. The Sith Empire collapsed without its endless supply of ships and weapons, and the Republic emerged battered but still standing. But victory came with consequences. The Jedi Order was decimated, its numbers thinned to the lowest point in centuries. The Republic's faith in the Jedi was shaken, haunted by the memory of how easily their greatest heroes had become their most dangerous enemies. And even with Revan's redemption, the scars of the war lingered. Planets lay in ruins, populations were displaced, and the shadow of betrayal hung heavy over the galaxy. The Night of 1,000 Tears is one of those events in Star Wars history that everyone is talking about, but few actually understand. It was an erasure, a cultural breaking point. To live through it meant to see your home burn, your cities reduced to ash, and your entire way of life shattered in a single, merciless strike. If you were alive during this era, especially if you were Mandalorian, every single day was shadowed by fear and uncertainty. For generations, Mandalorians had already been struggling with what it meant to exist after centuries of war. Their people were fractured. Some clung to the ancient warrior ways, houses, clans, armor, and combat as a creed. Others, especially on Mandalore itself, leaned into pacifism under Duchess Satine, wanting nothing more than peace and stability after ages of bloodshed. The galaxy often saw Mandalore as a proud warrior culture, but by the time of the Clone Wars, many Mandalorians were farmers, artisans, and merchants. Families just trying to live. Ordinary people who didn't want to wear helmets, didn't care about clan banners, and only wanted to raise their children without war hanging over them. But Mandalore has always had a curse. Peace never lasts there. The galaxy won't allow it. And that's what made living under this era so difficult. Even when you weren't carrying a blaster, you were a target. The people of Mandalore had barely survived civil wars between pacifists and traditionalists. Then the Clone Wars dragged them into the wider galaxy's conflict. After the fall of the Republic and the rise of the Empire, their culture became a battlefield yet again. By the time the Excision began, Mandalore had already been brutalized by Imperial rule. The Empire didn't see Mandalore as an ally or even as an enemy to respect. They saw it as a problem that had to be managed, a resource-rich world with warrior clans, too stubborn to stay quiet. At first, life under the Empire was tense but survivable. Stormtroopers occupied key cities, governors were installed, and house rivalries were manipulated to keep Mandalorians fighting each other instead of the Empire. For civilians, this meant curfews, rations, and constant surveillance. Food shortages were common, and any hint of rebellion brought brutal crackdowns. Imagine trying to raise a family in a society where the mere act of wearing traditional armor could be considered defiance. For many, survival meant silence, and yet Mandalorians are not the kind of people who remain silent for long. Resistance movements began to rise, clans whispered of rebellion, warriors trained in secret, and when the Empire finally realized that Mandalore's spirit could not be crushed through politics and occupation alone, they decided to end the problem in one catastrophic strike. That decision became known as the Mandalorian Excision. The Night of 1,000 Tears was annihilation. Orbital bombardments from TIE bombers rained down fire across the domed cities of Mandalore. Mandalore's surface had long been devastated by wars and environmental collapse, so its people lived under massive sealed biodomes, each one housing entire communities. When those domes were shattered, everything inside, homes, farms, families, was obliterated instantly. Survivors didn't describe it as a battle. They described it as watching the sky split open and pour death upon them. If you had been there, living inside one of those domes, imagine the sound of it. The shriek of sirens, the distant roar of ships, then the thunder as the shields collapsed and the glass above you fractured. Light, fire and smoke filling the sky. Streets you had walked every day suddenly crumbling into rubble. Neighbours screaming, families torn apart in the chaos. Some tried to flee to the underground tunnels, but even those weren't safe. The Empire's bombardment didn't leave hiding places intact. They wanted scorched earth, nothing left behind but glass and ash. Outside Mandalore, in the wider galaxy, people watched with a mix of horror and silence. News of the Excision was tightly controlled. The Empire didn't want the galaxy to see Mandalore as martyrs, only as a warning. For regular citizens on other worlds, life carried on. Markets bustled, trade continued, and holonet broadcasts told them only what the Empire wanted them to hear. But for those who knew Mandalorians personally, who had traded with them, or even fought alongside them in past wars, there was a quiet grief. It became one of those unspoken truths of living under the Empire. If they could do that to Mandalore, they could do it anywhere. For Mandalorians themselves, survival after that night became a question of exile. Clans scattered across the Outer Rim. Warriors went into hiding, keeping their armor close but concealed. Families who had once lived under the domes now became refugees, drifting from world to world, never fully trusted by outsiders and never fully safe from Imperial pursuit. Imagine what it meant to be a child in that time, raised in exile, told stories of the domes and fields of Mandalore, but never able to see them. Your culture became myth to you, not lived experience. That's what it was like under this era, to have your heritage taken from you, and to carry only fragments of it forward. For those who weren't Mandalorian, but lived under the Empire nearby, the Excision cast a long shadow too. Neighbouring systems suddenly saw an influx of refugees. Entire villages on backwater planets suddenly had Mandalorian families showing up at their door, armour battered, voices heavy with grief. Some locals welcomed them, others feared them, but all could feel the tension that followed. The Empire's message was clear: resist, and this will be your fate. Every refugee that survived was both a reminder of loss and a warning to others. Imagine trying to rebuild culture when the very symbols of your people, your armour, your language, your banners, could mark you for death. Imagine trying to teach your children about honour and clans when all you had to show them were ashes. Mandalorians became a people of whispers. Their songs were sung quietly around campfires in exile. Their armour was polished in private, not paraded in public. Their loyalty to each other grew even stronger, but so did their suspicion of outsiders. Survival meant closing ranks, trusting only clan and creed. And yet, in the middle of that despair, fragments of hope remained. Even as domes fell and fields burned, some Mandalorians still found a way to fight. Survivors joined rebel cells, lending their skills to the wider rebellion against the Empire. Others worked in shadows, plotting for the day Mandalore might rise again. This duality, grief and resilience, exile and defiance, defined life after the Night of 1,000 Tears. The era of the Sith triumvirate sits in one of the darkest chapters of Star Wars history. It was the aftermath of the Jedi Civil War, a time when the galaxy was scarred and fragile, reeling from Revan's campaigns, the betrayal of Malak, and the massive destruction left in their wake. Though the Republic technically survived, it was weak, disorganized, and unable to recover quickly from years of endless fighting. The Jedi Order fared even worse. Once thousands strong, the Jedi had been reduced to a scattering of survivors, hiding in remote corners of the galaxy. It was here, in this vacuum of power and despair, that three Sith Lords rose to prominence: Darth Nihilus, Darth Sion, and Darth Trier. The Sith triumvirate was less a united empire, and more a loose coalition of terror. Unlike the great Sith armies of earlier ages, this era's Sith were shadows and assassins, a hidden menace that thrived on the broken state of the galaxy. Each of the triumvirate's leaders embodied a different form of corruption, their powers fueled by wounds in the Force itself. Their purpose was not conquest in the traditional sense, but eradication. Specifically, the extermination of the Jedi Order once and for all. Darth Nihilus is perhaps the most infamous figure of this time. Known as the Lord of Hunger, he had become something beyond human, a void in the Force that consumed all life around him. Entire planets withered and died at his presence, their inhabitants reduced to lifeless husks as he fed on their essence. He was no longer a man but a wound given form, unable to exist without consuming. His very speech was incomprehensible, felt only through the Force as a dreadful resonance of hunger and emptiness. He did not kill out of malice or strategy, he fed because he had to, an endless hunger that could never be sated. Darth Sion, the Lord of Pain, was his opposite in many ways. Where Nihilus embodied absence, Sion embodied endurance through suffering. His body was broken, shattered beyond natural repair, yet he refused death by sheer willpower. His every movement was agony. his every moment of existence a torment, but he embraced it. Pain gave him strength, and through pain he lived. His form was scarred and ruined, held together not by flesh or bone, but by dark determination. Sion became a symbol of the Sith's philosophy taken to the extreme, that suffering and struggle were the path to survival and dominance. For the Jedi of this era, Sion was an unstoppable nightmare. To fight him was to watch him rise again and again, no matter how many times he was struck down. The third figure, Darth Trier, once known as Kreia, a Jedi Master, served as the architect of the triumvirate. Unlike Nihilus and Sion, she was not defined by a single extreme of corruption, but by her philosophy. She saw the Force itself as a manipulative, uncaring entity, binding all life into cycles of war and suffering. Disillusioned with both Jedi and Sith, she sought to reshape the galaxy by tearing down the Jedi Order and breaking the Force's influence over all beings. Her manipulation and cunning made her the triumvirate's teacher and strategist, guiding Nihilus and Sion while nurturing her own secret agenda. Life for ordinary citizens during this time was a strange duality. On one hand, in the core worlds, daily existence almost felt normal. Trade resumed, families rebuilt homes, local governments tried to patch over wounds. But in the mid-rim and outer rim, whispers of worlds disappearing circulated like ghost stories. Colonies vanished without explanation. Fleets investigating distress signals returned reporting entire settlements gone, their populations erased as if they had never existed. These were not rumours. These were the work of Nihilus. For the average farmer or merchant, his presence was apocalyptic. When his fleet entered orbit, resistance didn't matter. He would unleash his hunger, and the entire world would be left barren. Survivors did not exist. Either you were consumed or you were lucky enough to live on a world he had not yet touched. The uncertainty alone was enough to destabilize border systems, as populations abandoned settlements in hopes of fleeing Nihilus's shadow. Meanwhile, Darth Sion embodied a different terror. To his enemies, he was a nightmare that would not stay dead. For his soldiers, he was a brutal commander who ruled by fear and endurance. Imagine living on a planet under Sion's control. The garrisons were unstable, the soldiers cruel, and the promise of rebellion always crushed by his inevitable return. You could strike him down, but he would rise again. His presence alone shattered morale. For ordinary people, his warbands meant raids, forced labour, and endless suffering with no hope of liberation. The political climate of the Republic during the Triumvirate's shadow was confusion more than tyranny. Central government was weak, trying desperately to maintain legitimacy. Senators argued endlessly over resources. Core worlds stabilised, but rim systems felt abandoned. Local militias filled the vacuum, often leading to corruption and abuse. Citizens in core systems might hear stories of Sith atrocities and dismiss them as exaggerations. But for those living on the edge of Republic space, every whisper of a fleet, every unexplained silence from a neighbouring colony carried the weight of possible annihilation. For the average citizen, life became a gamble of geography. If you were born on Coruscant, you still had schools, trade and news on the holonet. Families could believe the worst was behind them, but if you lived in the mid-rim, you knew the galaxy was anything but safe. Parents hesitated to send their children to off-world academies, fearing raiders or worse. Merchants often had to choose between risking profitable but dangerous routes or sticking to safer, poorer markets. Communities relied more on self-defense and secrecy than faith in the Republic. For the Jedi, this was one of the bleakest times in their history. Many historians even consider it a second Great Purge, following the devastation wrought by Revan and Malak. Jedi who once lived openly as guardians of peace were reduced to fugitives, living in secrecy and fear. Some tried to hide their connection to the Force entirely, cutting themselves off in the hope of avoiding detection. Others gathered in remote enclaves, hoping to rebuild, only to be discovered and destroyed by the Triumvirate. Entire academies and temples were abandoned, their halls echoing with silence. The galaxy at large, exhausted from war, offered little sympathy. To many citizens, the Jedi had brought about their own downfall through arrogance and failure. Now let's talk about the Yuuzhan Vong War. That was a near-total collapse. The Yuuzhan Vong brought something new, terrifying, and alien: living weapons. Their ships weren't built of steel, but grown like creatures. Their weapons weren't blasters or turbolasers, but organisms that spat corrosive acid, plasma, or viruses. Even their armor wasn't forged. It was alive, bonded to their bodies. The galaxy was simply not prepared for an enemy that didn't play by the same rules of war. At first, few even believed the threat was real. Rumors trickled in from the outer rim about strange fleets, sudden disappearances of colonies, and entire worlds falling silent. To the core worlds, Coruscant, Corellia, Chandrila, it sounded like wild frontier gossip. But for those living on the edge of the galaxy, the war was not a rumor. It was the end of normal life. Imagine being a moisture farmer on some rim world when the Yuuzhan Vong arrived. The sky is full of alien ships, unlike anything you've ever seen, and before you know it, they unleash terraforming horrors, creatures that eat entire ecosystems, war beasts that stomp across fields, bioengineered nightmares that turn your homeworld into a twisted version of itself. The Vong didn't care about politics or local culture. To them, the galaxy was weak, decadent, and cursed by technology. Their plan wasn't to conquer and rule, it was to remake. They reshaped planets with biological tools, stripping away cities and infrastructure, replacing them with jungles of razor vines, seas of toxic algae, and skies filled with predatory swarms. For those who lived there, it was environmental annihilation. Your planet stopped being your planet overnight. The Vong had another feature: they couldn't be sensed through the Force. Jedi, who for millennia had been the guardians against galactic threats, suddenly found themselves blind. Their precognition failed. Their lightsabers couldn't always cut through the strange Vong armor. And worst of all, the Vong hunted Jedi specifically, seeing them as abominations to be destroyed. If you were Force sensitive during this war, you lived with a target on your back. For the average citizen, life under the Yuuzhan Vong War was a daily mix of fear, uncertainty, and displacement. Refugee fleets crisscrossed the stars. Whole populations were uprooted, flooding into safer core systems. Camps on Coruscant, Mon Calamari, and other stable worlds overflowed. Food shortages became common, inflation spiked, trade routes collapsed. If you were unlucky enough to be on a captured world, survival meant adapting to the brutal new order. The Yuuzhan Vong didn't simply enslave people, they sacrificed them to their gods in gruesome rituals, or they altered them through bioengineering experiments. Some captives were fused with organic implants against their will, twisted into tools or weapons. For everyday beings, this was a waking nightmare. Coruscant, the heart of the galaxy, became the symbol of the war's brutality. When the Yuuzhan Vong captured it, they remade it. The city world that had stood for thousands of years was reshaped into a living jungle, its towers toppled, its oceans poisoned. For citizens who had believed Coruscant to be the eternal, unshakable capital, this was shattering. Life in the core went from routine political squabbles and holonet debates to sheer survival. The psychological toll was enormous. Every day brought new reports of devastation. For people on the Rim, it was the destruction of their homes. For those in the core, it was the slow realization that the Republic couldn't protect them. Confidence in government plummeted. Black markets flourished. Local militias rose up as worlds realized the fleet might not arrive in time to defend them. Ordinary families packed emergency bags, kept ships fueled, and lived with the constant question, are we next? For soldiers and volunteers in the new Republic Defense Fleet, the war was unlike anything they had ever trained for. You couldn't disable a Vong ship by knocking out power conduits. It didn't have them. Boarding actions were fights through pulsating corridors of flesh and bone. Medical staff had to deal with infections and toxins no one had ever studied. And morale was constantly on edge, because the enemy's religious fanaticism meant they didn't retreat. Vong warriors fought to the death. Entire fleets willingly sacrificed themselves if it furthered their god's will. The Jedi, scattered and hunted, struggled to find a role. Some, like Luke Skywalker and his new order, fought directly. Others went underground, protecting small groups rather than confronting the Vong head-on. To ordinary people, the Jedi's diminished power was unsettling. For thousands of years, when things got bad, you could trust the Jedi to fix it. But during the Yuuzhan Vong War, even Jedi could die suddenly, with no warning, cut off from the Force that had always guided them. It made the galaxy feel even more hopeless. Economically, the galaxy bent under the strain. Whole industries collapsed. Starship manufacturers shifted to military contracts, leaving civilian markets dry. Farmers found their crops rotting because shipping lanes were destroyed. Merchants faced piracy as desperate groups preyed on refugees. Local governments imposed rationing, curfews, and strict travel restrictions. For everyday workers, life meant scarcity. Smaller meals, longer hours, and the gnawing anxiety that tomorrow could bring an invasion. By the time the war reached its peak, the New Republic itself fractured. Trust in the central government was gone. Some worlds seceded, hoping to cut deals with the invaders or simply survive alone. Others dug in, determined to resist no matter the cost. Families were torn apart. Parents sent children off-world to safer systems, not knowing if they'd ever reunite. Lovers separated in refugee evacuations. Communities scattered. After years of devastation, the Yuuzhan Vong were finally defeated through a mix of military resistance, Jedi resilience, and ultimately, diplomacy that allowed the war to end with the Vong surrendering. But the scars remained. Worlds were gone, populations were reduced, entire generations had grown up in fear. Living through the Yuuzhan Vong War meant seeing everything you took for granted collapse. Governments, economies, even the very ecosystems of planets. It was waking up each day uncertain if your home would survive, if your family would still be there tomorrow, or if the galaxy itself would still exist in recognizable form.